So basically, that's what we would like to discuss today. And also, we would like to discuss on this specific panel on that question of regulatory design. How to design new regulations using AI, such a tool and such an important technology and a disruptive technology as AI. And I think I was reading one of Catherine's papers about AI. I can change, okay. Well, I'll keep it in English for now. No, I'll keep it, Catherine. No, so basically what Catherine wrote is like, and she used this phrase that I think it's quite helpful. It's you take AI and it looks like a hammer, and you want to start just, and once you have that idea, everything starts looking like a nail. You want to use AI all the time, perhaps as the solution for every single regulatory question and problem that we are facing. And that's where regulatory design, such an important decision on what kind of regulation we want to have, is what we are going to be discussing right now. So then I will speak in Spanish, but hopefully the English work there. Thank you very much. And we will start with you, Dan. So Dan, I think you're going to bring us to the experience also of the work you had been doing. I would like to start with asking you perhaps that you help us to understand more about these taxonomies, some of the main concepts that are being used in order to start introducing AI into the regulatory process, into regulatory design. And then also, if it will be great if you can tell us a little bit more about the public-private partnerships and the kind of work that you had been doing and you had been elaborating on, especially on how private institutions can be supportive of public agencies and regulatory agencies. So Dan, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Armando. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks, Sebastian and your team. What a great session for those of us here in the room today and those of us around the world who are tuning in. So we hope this will be an engaging discussion. I'm confident that with our panelists, we will have that. As you heard, I run the IBM Center for the Business of Government. We are essentially a think tank inside IBM. We do research on issues of interest to government leaders in the US and around the world. In fact, I'm just back from 3 days meeting with Australian CIOs who were on a tour in Silicon Valley, California. So we do a lot of engagement with governments around the world. And we basically bring this research to try to address issues of practice. So what are practitioners facing around the world? What are government managers facing? How can research on new models, private sector adoption of private sector techniques, to your public-private partnerships question? What are other governments doing? And we ask academics to kind of put that in a research frame and then develop practical, actionable recommendations on that. We have done, actually, I believe, 17, maybe now 18, reports over the last 7 or so years around AI and government in many different settings. All of our reports are free and in the public domain, and they're available at our website, which is businessofgovernment.org, one word. Or you could just Google me. I'm the only Dan Shanok in the world. So if you Google me, you'll get to our center. That might be easier. Less keystrokes. I did work in the US government for many years, actually in the same office at OMB that Susan Dudley ran. I was an executive in that office and actually was part of the team 25 years ago or so that started the e-rulemaking initiative. And we have a leader of that initiative here in the room. I'll give shout out to Virginia Huth, who worked with me at OMB and later was the leader of that initiative. So we may phone a friend during the session if we need to on that. And have really been honored to work and learn from Kerry Colanisi. In fact, wrote a chapter in a book he did recently on AI and procurement, which I'll come back to because there are some parallels to this. So that's a little bit more about me. So if you think about sort of taxonomy of regulatory design, there are many different pieces, and we've in various different panels today, we've kind of touched on those pieces, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework, the first and how AI can fit into each stage. The beginning of a regulatory process is somebody sees that there's a problem that needs regulating, and they have to determine that existing market mechanisms don't solve the problem. There needs to be some sort of government action, whether it's sort of a classical regulation requiring business to do something, whether it's an information-based rule that basically says, let's put out more information into the market so that people can make better decisions. there are rules about how spending money. Many federal regulations in the US and abroad are all about how do we spend money. But it's the teams that are kind of thinking about how do we implement programs before it gets into the world of regulation in sort of that narrow box, are thinking about how do we use this process to address a particular problem that the government is trying to solve. And AI can help to basically perform that ex ante analysis of, all right, what's the state of the world look like today, whether it's in a particular financial sector, whether it's regulations governing student financial aid in the United States in terms of affordability, whether it's regulations that govern how funds are distributed to persons in need at the state and local level. Sort of what's the state of the world today? And AI can help government analysts basically bring together large amounts of data that are sitting in different databases all over the country often, and provide some scenarios and say, all right, here are the parameters that you have identified as important for the government program, often set out in law. And then here is what the data that's distributed, sort of Catherine and I were talking earlier, in a federated sense. You can design AI and algorithmic investigation to bring all that data in to create a set of decisions for regulatory planners to say, all right, here's how we're going to do a rule on this topic. Here's, or first of all, do we need to do a rule to address the issues, or can the objective that we have be addressed through some other way? And that's an important principle in the U.S. executive order and rulemaking in terms of deciding when to regulate. By the way, I did spend time at OECD working on regulatory reform, so I have done some of this work around looking at countries around the world as well. So that's kind of all the design stage, is sort of helping to identify the state of data that can help to solve a problem. Then you get into actually the development of the regulatory approach. And it would take a team of people, a lot of the time you say, well, what are the alternatives, different alternatives to approaching rulemaking? And it's often sort of when I was back in the Stone Ages, when I was at OMB, we would work with agencies and there would be teams of people who would develop large scale alternative scenarios that we would then get big voluminous books on in terms of regulatory impact analysis and other supporting documents. And it would all be done by hand, and including all of the initial analysis, sort of the initial collection of data in order to do the analysis. And through the use of AI techniques, it's much easier for regulatory planners and developers to basically say, all right, here's the data we have on a particular problem. Let's chat with our database, if you will, and have a discussion around, all right, alternative A, alternative B, alternative C. What are the first, second, and third order impacts of those discussions, so that you can then present to decision makers, right? Because in most cases, regulations are adjudicated, if you will, before they're issued by political or very senior career decision makers who don't have time to get into a lot of the specifics about that. So it can help staff provide to regulatory decision makers sort of a much more cogent set of, and do this more quickly, a sort of a cogent set of choices from which to choose this regulatory alternative or that. And then as you're developing the rule, because most rules have an analysis section which requires you to explain what are the other alternatives and how did you decide on the one you chose versus the others, sort of those are developed. So you can think about developing these sort of language models that then bring in the first part, the design part, and then actually create regulatory scenarios in terms of the text that's used to develop the rule. And then the human in the loop, if you will, or the human overseer of that process has to look at it, make sure it's correct, make adaptations, provide for advanced analysis. So it kind of moves the regulatory planning team kind of up the value stack, so they don't have to spend, instead of spending 80% of their time gathering data, so that they can spend, their precious 20% of the time trying to make decisions and make sense out of the data, it shortens the time frame and the amount of time it takes to kind of collect the data and develop these regulatory alternatives. So those are both kind of important pieces of design, and that's in the proposed rule stage. And then you get into public engagement. And you've developed the rule, you send the rule out for comment, and a big part of regulatory design is collecting public comment, analyzing that public comment, and then developing scenarios for a final rule. And again, that's always been done manually. There's been a lot of work done. In fact, Virginia's team at GSA has done experimentation on this as well, where how you can use AI to basically analyze large swaths of public comment, look for patterns, create different types of sort of where are the comments that are pretty much the same, so that we can have our team focus on like the really interesting 20% of the comments that are saying something new and different, and get to that type of analysis much more quickly. And that can be done in different ways using sort of text-based algorithms as you look there. And then I know you're going to have a panel on enforcement later today, and that's sort of post-design. But the interesting thing about enforcement, this may be a lead into Catherine a little bit, is that you can use AI to basically monitor performance against regulatory standards, and to say, all right, who are the businesses, all the businesses that are doing reporting, publicly available administrative data, perhaps in an environmental context around the environmental conditions and around a particular plant that's being regulated by the natural resource regulator. And then that can tell you, all right, here's the existing set of rules, including the rule that we just issued, plus all the other stock of rules that rule kind of works with. And then here's how that's working in practice, which can point to, all right, here's where we have to go back and tweak the system. And Catherine will have a lot more to say about that. The last thing I'll say is that there are, underlying all of these, there are a set of, I talked a lot about possibility and opportunity. There are a set of risks that need to be mitigated at every stage. And we talked about them a little bit today already. I know that David will talk about these as well, is around sort of making sure that there's transparency in the system, so that the regulated community and also citizens that are subject of the sort of the companies who are in the economic market, who are providing products and services that are being regulated. So it's important for them to have transparency. It's also important for the people that are actually buying those products or services to understand how regulation affects their world. And so sort of building in, as you're building those algorithms, building in transparency, both for the direct regulated entities, but also those that are affected. Bias, mitigating bias data, making sure that data that are being used in regulation reflect the state of the world and aren't like, 10 or 15-year-old databases that are not going to lead to a proper regulatory decision today. And there's been review of the accuracy of that data. And I know some of the material in the preparatory materials that for this conference talked about some work that Catherine's been done, that Carrie Colanisi has been done around these issues. So all of this is really important to think. Yes, there's vast opportunity, right? AI can do really good things. It's not for everything, as you say. It's not hammers looking for nails, or as sometimes I like to say, it's not peanut butter. You spread it over everything and it tastes better. You have to find the right sandwich. And so from that, I will thank you all. Look forward to the discussion. I'll come back to public-private partnerships later, but I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you. I was going to just, if I may, Dan, a follow-up question there, very briefly. So on that process that you have just explained about regulatory design, and those perhaps adaptations and the transparency that you want to provide to the process, what would you think will be the 2-3 best practices that you have identified on using AI for this kind of regulatory design process right now? Like if you have on top of your mind.
Yeah, I think developing a model that can gather data that I talked about, that can bring in information to develop a regulatory, basically the text of a rule, developing a model that can enable an analyst to do that more effectively, more accurately, looking at data that's, if you think about pre-AI, it was as much as the human or the human and their team could read, right? That was the world that they lived in. And now they have basically a partner that can look at a much larger set of data in this kind of federated learning model and bring in information to make that regulatory decision. So that's one. I would say that the common analysis work, there's some really interesting work being done on using AI to help make sense of large numbers, hundreds of thousands of public comments, often some of which are very complex technically, and again requires a lot of different work. And you can actually develop then decision trees from those comments that can say, all right, here's what we thought of as our first set of regulatory alternatives. You can build a model, say, test those against the comments that are coming in, and then reframe the alternatives for final rule decision making So those are two different use cases that I think are really important and have been actually experimented with.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And now, Catherine, I think that sets the path perfectly for your intervention. And well, I'm going just to frame it on a question that we have on, yeah, basically the data. We had been talking about a lot about the data. You had been working on this kind of research, trying to look into what kind of data we can obtain, the retrospective, prospective approach in that sense to get this data and try to analyze the impact of these potential regulations. And that's, of course, very important for the design. So building upon that, Catherine, hearing from you, of course, of this kind of approach to the data infrastructure, the data structure, the taxonomies also that Dan has been talking about, and also about the interoperability and learning that we can build upon all these kind of projects and the idea of regulators on thinking and using AI. How can we structure this in a way in which it makes sense for that design process? So, thank you.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Armando. Wonderful to be part of this panel. Sebastian, I know months ago, I think we started to talk and I had one condition. Well, first I'll tell you before the condition. I was enormously flattered to be asked to come and very much behind the project of focusing on governmental use. So I have to say that over the past, I don't know, decade of conversations and things that I've been drawn into about things like regulating AI in the private sector, what's the best governance model, et cetera, it's often missed, actually, because there haven't been as many publicly available reports about how governments are themselves using AI and the kinds of pilots. And an insight that I had and I've now written about is sort of, you can glean, I think, regulatory insights from study of how government itself is using these technologies. And then the second point relates to, so that's kind of some of the promise of AI, the perils of AI. You hear a lot, lots of conferences are convened about transparency, accountability, explainability. Well, where would you go in the United States to try to see where those kinds of uses might be required to be transparent, accountable, subject in the rulemaking process to judicial review, where they would have to give some modicum of explainability? So before sort of just jumping to think about how government stands there to regulate these technologies, I think it's really important to focus on the governmental uses for those two reasons. So that was my excitement for joining. The condition was I happen to be teaching, I'm at NYU School of Law. I happen to this semester be teaching, among other things, a seminar on artificial intelligence. So I welcome my students who are all live stream. Maybe they'll ask some very difficult questions of this group, but it's required that they're watching our panel, but it's very relevant. And so I have to say I'm here in equal parts to try to share maybe some insights that I have from my work, but literally equal parts to learn. Because one of the deficits of the seminar that I teach is it's very myopic. It's focused on regulation and civil liability of AI in the United States. And we have enormous interest at NYU from students themselves who are international students or students who have a lot of international interest, and they're very eager to hear from all of the other panelists who are bringing to this the actual pilots and use cases that are happening in other countries. And it opens up an enormous space for learning and study for them and others to do kind of comparisons across some of these pilots, but also to probe some of the deeper differences, some worries. This was mentioned in some of the comments from the floor earlier of like, you don't just take a technology that maybe works in the United States in their regulatory process and, plop it down in a country that's facing different kinds of infrastructure, human rights, or other issues. These are things that students, really capable students, are very eager to take part in studying. So that's sort of my enthusiasm for being here. Let me very briefly build on what Dan was talking about. My own interest in AI actually stemmed because I teach not only administrative law, but tort law in the United States. And I'm particularly interested in the regulation of health and safety, including medical devices, drugs, from both the public and private side. And a long, long time ago, before AI was sort of front and center in everyone's minds, I started to realize that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, must have built up a lot of internal capacity to evaluate AI. And how did I know this? Well, they were approving AI-enabled medical devices. And I thought that was kind of fascinating and got me very interested in what was happening within the federal government. In 2020, as Carrie generously alluded to, I was part of a really exciting collaborative study. He mentioned it was teams from Stanford and NYU. I was the only one from NYU, but we had several collaborators from Stanford, and the real resource that we had is teams of students. You'll see a theme here. I'm very much a believer in extremely capable students that we had. We had law students, we had PhD students in economics, political science, data science. And together what we did is we did a canvas, Carrie alluded to this, of all the use cases that we could find that were public, that we could find public-facing information. That's sort of part one of our study. And absolutely, it was an underreporting. At the time, there was no existing federal inventory of those use cases. There were a lot of agencies that touted using artificial intelligence, but when you looked into the use case, they were using an Excel spreadsheet, so we didn't mark that as AI use. And then there were lots that were in a kind of very exploratory phase. But the more interesting parts of that report, and I really encourage, if you're interested, to look at the report, it's on acus.gov, acus.gov. That stands for the Administrative Conference of the United States, which is an independent agency in the federal regulatory system that sometimes commissions reports from academics. Part two was a real deep dive into particular use cases. So one of them actually was the FDA and the way they were using these technologies for regulatory analysis. There's also an example of the SEC in enforcement. There's an example of the Social Security Administration in adjudication. They're real deep dives that involved a lot of field work of interviews with the agency officials who were implementing those programs. And then part three of it raises all sorts of trans-substantive issues about things like building internal capacity, about bias, about accountability, transparency. So, and what we tried to do is we gleaned specifically from these deep dive use cases to see where we saw some commonality of problems or things that had arisen in those contexts. But what I really want to talk about, and I will have to do it quickly, I know, and I apologize to the translators, you can commiserate with my students. I speak quickly, so I'm going to try to speak slower and clearly, but I did a 2023 additional ACUS study that I just want to allude to. It's called AI in Retrospective Review. And it had some commonalities with the larger study we did, which is that it involved field work. So here I had some students again, and we went in and we were interviewing agency officials. We also interviewed private contractors, those who were developing the AI tools that we had found in the use cases. And we also interviewed a whole bunch of stakeholders, so groups that were public interest organizations that were worried about particular uses or abuses of AI. And we tried to interview some people in the regulated entities. So we conducted over 50 in-depth interviews as part of this study. And we have 4 use cases, and I think each one shows a nugget or a kernel of something that's quite interesting. The first one was from the Department of Health and Human Services. And what was unique about that, it was the very first time in the US regulatory system where a use of AI in any of the rulemaking that Dan very nicely set out sort of from start or finish was alluded to. And it was called the Regulatory Cleanup Initiative. It was an AI tool that was used to look at the corpus of regulations and identify things. We might call it low-hanging fruit or cleanup. Look at cross-references that were alluded to in the regulatory impact panel. Often were broken cross-references. They didn't go to anywhere. They went to an outdated or outmoded place, typographical errors, things like that. And it flagged over 100 of those. Once the tool flagged them, it went to the subject matter experts and they did a check. And then they published a final rule where they had gone through and corrected all these things. So that was the first use of an AI tool that was flagged in a final rulemaking. And it was quite interesting to see that it had those capabilities, but of course, maybe an AI tool could do a lot more than that. The second use case is actually from the Department of Defense. They used an AI tool called Game Changer. And they were using this tool not in the regulatory process, but they were using it, and this was alluded to before, this idea of AI might be particularly good in terms of sorting through, classifying, and organizing mounds of documents. So the Department of Defense had a problem on their hands, which is they had all of these policy documents that were conflicting and overlapping, and were trying to figure out who within their agency had various different operational responsibility and the like. So they developed this tool internally, and I had the advantage, I talked to many of the individuals who had then left Department of Defense but had developed the tool, talked with them about how they did this, why it was important that it was developed in-house and with the subject matter experts, and then it was handed off, and they did contract with a contractor, but it was the demands on that were that it be open source and that it be interoperable. And that was intriguing to me because I do think that that maybe changes the procurement game a bit. Like if you already have an existing tool and you've developed it in-house and then you have this partnership with an outside collaborator, you're not as likely to get vendor lock-in with a particular outside contractor who comes in and says, we can do this, but we can't share any of the technology, et cetera. Third example was Department of Transportation. And I alluded to this slightly in my question to one of the previous panelists, because what was fascinating to me about Department of Transportation, they had a tool much like the tools that we saw in the previous panel that was trying to figure out regulatory load of certain Department of Transportation regulations. But what opened my eyes in the interviews and talking with them is they talked about how within that agency, they didn't have the necessity of having a sophisticated NLP, natural language tool that would go through and kind of structure this very disorganized set of regulations. They had very structured rules, right? It was they knew exactly within the rule where you would identify who had particular obligations and what they were and where they went. And that's what gleaned the insight that I had before about, I think that there's a way in which all of these tools that are used both ex ante to project costs or in retrospective review, namely looking at bodies of existing regulations and trying to figure out where they're overlapping, redundant, or outmoded, that knowledge can be harnessed in terms of prospective rulemaking. I think it gives insights about a better way, not just the idea that rules should all be machine readable and will be in a world that we're just run by rule as code with no humans, but just in terms of like things that were discussed in the last panel about structure, simplification, trying to have some discipline in the rulemaking process. Okay, final case example was a pilot actually that was within GSA and CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid within HHS. And they did two different pilots. One had to do with the notice and comment that Dan alluded to. And the second, it was a small pilot, but it was interesting, was called cross-domain analysis. And they were basically, they had a subset of CMS rules. They had asked it was like a CAN subset, right? So it was a limited domain. They had asked the subject matter experts to identify conflicts where there were two different regulations that told an entity to do conflicting things, where there were overlapping redundancies. And then they had a tool that they partnered actually with a company from the Netherlands to develop. And they had this tool that went through and tried to flag and identify those. And I was a kind of witness to that pilot because I was writing about it for the ACUS project. And it was really fascinating to see how the development of the tool could be shaped by input from the subject matter experts. So I'll leave you with just one insight that returns us back to the classroom and students and my experience in this space, which is I think it's important to not have this view that the technologist will develop the tool and then lawyers or law policy people will decide later down the road, thumbs up, thumbs down, right? Or here are the good and bad features. It's extremely important as these tools are developed in mission-specific ways within agencies that there's these collaborations that are done between the policy subject matter experts and the technologists. And in some of the previous panels, it sounded like that's exactly what was happening in these pilots. And I find that incredibly exciting. Thank you.
Please, thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. I think this is, of course, extremely exciting, perhaps just also as a follow-up question there on that collaboration, yeah. We have been trying, I think, in Latin America for the last years to increase collaboration among different stakeholders, especially for this kind of regulatory discussions. Personally, for example, I had been exploring sandboxes as a way of increasing that collaboration and in a way of increasing that dialogue between different stakeholders. What do you think could be one of the very specific tools we can use to try to increase that? Because it sounds as something as a good practice, as something we should be doing, but how, when we are there building these projects, how can we build that kind of conversation and dialogue between, as you mentioned, policymakers, lawyers, people with different expertise, of course?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Dan wants to jump in, I can tell. So let me just say, I'm going to say two separate things. One has a little bit more with federal agencies kind of building that internal capacity. So the FDA, for example, had an internal incubator, and they were developing some of these AI technologies within the agency. But it was alluded to before that in this space, they're not going to be able to compete with the private sector, et cetera. They had developed some really interesting initiatives, like an entrepreneur in residence, where they were getting someone from the private sector to come in and work within their incubator. There are all these partnerships with universities. It was alluded to before. A partnership with Stanford. I think that entities, this might sound self-serving, but it's serving my students, not myself. I think that students and universities can really be an incredible resource here. So somebody said to me, how did you get all these NYU students to spend so many hours on all of these field studies? They were eager for it, right? They're trying to study, and increasingly within the law school, because the study of law in the US is very interdisciplinary. We're attracting more and more students who come with very sophisticated technological backgrounds. And I've had a few, but I should have more. I've had a few instances where someone working on either a governmental, usually it's a governmental pilot project, will try to harness. They'll ask if we have students who would be interested in writing a white paper, or we'd be collaborating with technologists. In one of the studies that I alluded to, along with a team of students, I wrote like an administrative law primer white paper for those who were developing the technology so that they could understand what would happen down the road in the regulatory process. So that's from my myopic university approach, but I think you...
I'll just be quick so that we can get to our other speakers. I just want to give a reference to your question. So the National Academy of Public Administration, which is a sort of like the National Academy of Sciences for government practitioners and academics studying government. I'm a fellow there. Virginia's also a fellow. And there's about 1,000 of them around the country and around the world, just came out with a study on agile policymaking, which built on a prior study about agile rulemaking. And both of those studies, they talked about things like creating sandboxes where government and industry and academic experts might come together to develop and test kind of modular approaches to a rulemaking. And you could apply AI at each stage of this modular process so that you could basically develop a rule in pieces as opposed to a traditional kind of rulemaking process where everybody kind of locks themselves and their team in a room for 6 months to a year and comes out with a rule. So you can actually Google for the Agile Regulation Report, which will get you to some examples that you're asking about.
Thank you both. And I think this question is also related to a very important point, that is participation, and how to build a more inclusive dialogue about the use of AI by regulators and the regulatory process. Basically, because regulation means that those are the rules that are going to protect consumers, that are going to protect citizens. How the participation is taking place in that conversation, and I think there, David, you're going to present to us some perhaps ideas and tools in order to start thinking about that responsible use, trustworthy use, because basically then we start using AI, people are excited about this, but then also comes criticism, and very valid criticism about this participation, who is involved, what kind of AI systems we're using. So David, the floor is yours to help us to deal also now with that question on the regulatory design. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And it's a real honor to be here. I was thrilled to get the invitation to come. So just to say, I am, very nice, okay. We're getting the stage for ourselves. Just say, so I wear two hats. I'm a professor at Queen Mary University of London, professor in ethics, technology, and society, but I'm also the director of ethics and responsible innovation research at the Alan Turing Institute, which is Great Britain's National AI and Data Science Institute, now going on 8 years actually at that position. And what I wanted to sort of start with and share with you today were really some notes from the field in that capacity, because in the capacity as the director of ethics at the Turing, I've served an advisory function to public sector bodies for a number of years. So the advisory function has worked both in the UK's public sector, working with dozens of local authorities, which are their municipal governments, as well as various government departments. But then internationally, the advisory function has taken my work to the Council of Europe and UNESCO and UN's HLab and the World Bank and the G7. I've served advisory functions across all those bodies. And I think one of the commonalities of all of that work has really been that we need trusted friends to sort of speak sensibly about the limitations of the technology so that we don't waste resources, so that we don't fall prey, if you will, to FOMO, to fear of missing out, to sort of running into technologies without the kind of reflexivity that we need to manage our own expectations. So basically what I will do today is I will run through some of the broader ethical and human rights concerns around using AI in regulatory design and regulation in general. And then I'll speak a little bit about some governance strategies and some pathways forward in terms of operationalizing responsible AI and practical principles. And so, and I'll draw on some of the work that's come out, the concrete policy work that's come out of the Turing. So first to say, we don't need to belabor this, but we know that we're experiencing a kind of, industrial revolution of AI, right? There's now so many opportunities to use AI across government functions, and we've had a lot of great examples today of how certain models can be used, for instance, large language models for streamlining regulation, simplifying and summarizing texts, analyzing texts, how machine learning can be used in regulatory impact assessment, predictive risk modeling, compliance functions, automated monitoring and algorithmic enforcement are also areas that are amenable to data-driven and machine learning analysis. But I would point out that there have been many studies recently that the narrative about productivity gains is something we should take with a grain of salt. Now, we've seen in cases productivity losses, for instance, where when you introduce a system into a workflow, you'll have what's called cognitive interruption. You'll have over-reliance, which leads to poor decision-making quality. You might even have loss of the quality of outputs. One thing that we're seeing now, and this is again me being a trusted friend, a devil's advocate, one thing we're seeing increasingly is from November of 2022, the flooding of our information ecosystem with synthetically generated information and data is now and will be affecting the data sets that are used moving forward to further develop models. And it's the studies shown that will lead to model collapse, right? There will be a kind of erring to the median, which will actually it's been studied and shown to show decline in model performance. And so we have to be really aware that as public sector advisors, as public sector policymakers, there's a real importance of understanding limitations and understanding that we don't need to treat this as Maslow's hammer, that AI is the hammer where everything looks like a nail. We need to really think in terms of the context of the use case, et cetera. So with that said, what I wanted to present first to you is one broad challenge that's presented when we think of adopting AI broadly in regulation, and then about 4 ethical concerns. So first, the kind of bigger picture challenge is, we can call this the democratic legitimacy challenge. So regulations directly impact fundamental rights and freedoms, as we all know, putting the onus of human-centered, equitable, and responsible regulatory action on individual regulators as duty bearers rather than on statistical systems. So we have to understand that the public sector bodies are subject to human rights regulation, human rights law, and it's a central feature of responsible innovation in that context, that individuals are accountable for the decisions that they're making with regard to fundamental rights and freedoms. And so we really do need to be careful in automation and the adoption of AI that continues to be a priority. Second, fully automated algorithmic governance and complex and distributed AI innovation life cycles raise questions about accountability gaps and deficits in public duties of care, right? So we have these very complex AI supply and value chains that's creating an extremely complicated distribution of layers of accountability, answerability, auditability. And so we have to be very careful when we think about adopting AI in regulation that we pay close attention to having end-to-end human accountability. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Finally, in terms of the democratic legitimacy challenge, is this focus on, we've heard a lot today about efficiency, but when you focus on technocratic efficiency, you risk displacing fundamental forms of deliberation, democratic governance, values-oriented regulatory practice, and civic agency. And so we really need to think of the practices of carrying out a regulatory remit as social and democratic practices. These have to be informed by rich and robust forms of deliberation. They need to be participatory. They need to engage impacted communities. And the more that we lean into technocratic efficiency and move away from deliberative mechanisms, the more we put that kind of legitimacy, that democratic legitimacy at risk. Okay, so the first concern that I would raise in terms of the big picture problems potentially ethically with adopting AI in regulation is embedded historical bias. So we know that training data encodes past discriminatory enforcement patterns. This can lead to data-driven entrenchment and amplification of biases. We see this in general public services where oftentimes there'll be biased practices that lead to biased data sets that then gets kind of entrenched and amplified when you use predictive risk modeling based upon that data. We also see that proprietary large language models and foundation models, so these large models that are being used today, they favor dominant legal languages, dominant legal styles of reasoning, and dominant historical and cultural traditions, potentially leading to deep-seated cultural biases and epistemic injustice, especially in relation to historically marginalized and underserved groups. So, you know, one of the projects that I've been working on is with MENA countries, so in the Middle East and North Africa, looking at how large language models are being adopted in those contexts. We see extreme examples of misapplication of global North kind of Western-oriented language models that aren't fit for purpose in contexts that are not, contexts that don't reflect the base population that's been feeding into these large proprietary Silicon Valley models, and we have to be careful about that. And finally, the regulatory burden is not distributed equitably across populations. So when you think about the way that data-driven systems can be used in regulation, if you don't have equity in society, that will be reflected in the application. So for instance, say you're trying to build a model that has to do with I don't know, economic data, right? If you have a context, a country context, where there's a robust informal economy, right? So where people are involved in economy but aren't generating data, right? They aren't generating data for their credit. They deal largely in cash. It's those people that won't be picked up in the regulatory modeling. And so we have to be especially careful to be contextually responsive when we think about this. Concern to explainability illusion. So there'll be a lot of talk you'll hear about explainability and how there's advancements in explainability. The actual case is, and I co-wrote, or I was the principal author of the UK's AI explainability guidance. Complex machine learning models will generally resist meaningful interpretation. They have high dimensionality, so they have many variables. Humans in our semantic understanding can put together 4, 5 to 10 variables at a time. These systems are and covariates. They have covariates and variables that are connecting thousands, hundreds of thousands, and now millions of data points at a time. And when we're thinking about the interpretability of how the decision making is working on a complex model like that, we won't have a proper model of that. There's estimations, but there's challenges on the fidelity of those, and we have really big problems even with conventional machine learning models. Post hoc explanations often lack, as I was saying, fidelity, and they can obscure rather than clarify the truly determinative or associated factors. In addition to this, large language models and foundation models offer a kind of another layer of opacity, right? So whereas as normal neural networks, we kind of look at the decision boundary and we try to find the gradient at the decision boundary to give an idea of what's affecting the output in the mapping function. For large language models, these are semantic models of language, they're semantic models. And so you can't look at a decision boundary when you've got literally billions of parameters in natural language. And so you'll hear about, various big, larger tech companies talking about how they're coming up with these interpretable kind of examinations of the electronic brain, like Anthropic talks about. But the truth is that in the science of interpretability and explainability, it's a scandal because there is no effective interpretability method available so far. And in my interactions with government, especially in the UK, you see that the uses of large language models, because they know that there's no interpretability or explainability, are now very narrow. They don't work in open language as such, because they know that if something goes wrong, they won't be able to explain it. And we know, finally, this has come up before, but black box algorithmic decision making will violate due process rights and when things go wrong, because you can't explain why they did. I mentioned distributed accountability before. I won't belabor the point, but we have to really be aware that because there is this distributed character of complex value chains, that it will be increasingly difficult, especially now with the multi-phase large language models, where you've got proprietary base models, you've got downstream applications that are fine-tuned, you've got lots of stages that are involved. The final concern I'll point to is what's called the training serving skew. And basically, I mentioned this also before, kind of referring to equity, but models trained on global north data often fail in Latin American and Caribbean contexts, but the lack of availability of data of sufficient quality and quantity in Latin American and Caribbean contexts often compels the use of unfit data sets, right? So it's important to recognize that the limitations of data really will translate, because a lot of these predictive and modeling functions are very contextually dependent. And because they're contextually dependent, you can't take data from, American data, European, British data, and then just use that to predict social systems, social patterns in other places. And yet you do see that oftentimes now, especially with global vendors. Population biases can also affect this training serving skew, where you've got demographic shifts where from the training population to the served population, where the models don't adapt to unseen data from those different demographic populations. And finally, we have what we call model drift, or shifts in underlying data distributions, leading to poor and unpredictable outcomes, which means that if you're training a system on a particular data set from a particular time or place, and then you're applying that trained mapping function to a time and place that's different, or that has a different underlying distribution of patterns, it won't function well. And yet we do see still there's a lot of misuse of models because they're not contextually responsive to shifts in underlying data distributions. Okay, with that said, I will quickly run through maybe a couple of ways we can think of paths forward from this. First, I would say in the ancient history of AI in 2018, the Alan Turing Institute undertook the writing of the UK's national guidance on AI ethics and safety in the public sector. This work has become the basis of the governance mechanisms I'll talk about today. It really did start with really ethnographic fieldwork in the Ministry of Justice and in the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. the Information Commissioner's Office is the data protection regulator in the UK. That work formed the normative or the kind of principled foundation of the guidance. We published it in 2019. It's since now had a life of its own. It's been put into practice across the UK and further. For instance, the Financial Conduct Authority, the ICO, are UK regulators that have used it. Now, that base guidance was then in the UK's National AI Strategy in 2021 called on to be expanded and to build a kind of AI ethics and governance and practice program, which is what I'll finish up talking about today. And that work started in 2021. We engaged regulators, we engaged public sector organizations from across the world in this, and produced 8 practice-based workbooks that we ended up finally publishing them in 2024 and 2025. So basically, and now I'll refer back to some of the challenges that I spoke about before. Basically, the way the responsible and trustworthy AI project lifecycle, according to that guidance, works is you have to start with certain sort of fundamental values, or even we can even say human rights principles, if that's the set of values that support, underwrite, and motivate responsible AI projects insofar as they provide criteria against which to judge potential social and ethical impacts. So you need to have ethical or human rights criteria first and foremost when you're asking 0 questions: should we be doing this? What is the impact of this system? You have to start with various criteria, adopted criteria. In the European example, right now, they're oriented to fundamental rights. There's fundamental rights impact assessment that does this. The Council of Europe has a human rights, democracy, and rule of law impact assessment that uses the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the baseline. Now, at the second level, we have what we call the safety principles. And these are really, these are practical principles that provide actionable goals. So sustainability, safety, accountability, fairness, explainability, and data stewardship are the safety principles that we have in the guidance. And then finally, if we're thinking about the way in which those principles are operationalized, we have a process-based governance framework, which ensures end-to-end accountability and provides a template for documenting necessary governance actions. So you have your normative goals, you figure out what you need to do to achieve those goals, and then you document what those actions have been. That's what the process-based governance framework is, basically. I won't go through this in too much detail, but the safety principles basically cover what we might call a convergence of understanding and practical principles. So there's been hundreds of AI ethics frameworks written. These safety principles are basically a consolidation of the central elements of those. The process-based governance framework then operationalizes these. So just to use one of the concerns about equity and injustice. So in fairness, the AI ethics and governance and practice program has 3 mechanisms. We have bias self-assessment, we have bias risk management, and fairness position statements as part of the kind of governance practices involved in assuring that the system has addressed those issues. So for instance, when you're looking at cultural biases in a large language model, in the process-based governance framework, you would initially engage the data to identify possibilities for bias in the data, then biases in the inferences that the model's producing, et cetera. And then I will definitely close here by just pointing to, if you're interested in looking at this work, it's you just Google AI ethics and governance in practice. But the program has
No, that's Sabrina's presentation. So
sorry, I was going the opposite way. So you can see the program has 8 modules, an introduction that goes through the kind of socio-technical dimension of AI, and then sustainability, fairness, data stewardship, safety, transparency, and accountability. And then I'll leave it there.
Thank you, David. That was plenty of information, and that ethical, trustworthy question is not an easy one. But and of course, there is a lot of food for thought there. But now we would like to move to Sabrina. Sabrina, because you're going to tell us about what is happening in Brazil. Now, this is, of course, extremely helpful because all these points that have been discussed by Dan, Catherine, Daniel, you're now showing us that actually Brazil is doing this. So we are talking about a project that is being implemented, and I think that is going to be very important for that kind of question on regulatory design. Also, it's a case that is close to many other Latin American colleagues. So it's, of course, a case that becomes a reference because if Brazil is doing it, perhaps other countries in the region will consider this. So very important to hear from you, Sabrina, from this case, from the cost analysis and the tools that you're using and how AI is being used for that specific purpose. So thank you for being here, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll take advantage of the interpretation and speak in Portuguese.
Yeah, please.
Obrigada pelo convite, Bide. É um prazer estar aqui nesse painel e aproveito para fazer um disclaimer que eu não sou especialista em inteligência artificial, não sou em tecnologia, mas trabalho com políticas públicas há mais de 20 anos. E hoje a gente sabe que o processo de elaboração, implementação, monitoramento, fiscalização de políticas públicas passa cada vez mais pelo uso de ferramentas digitais, tecnológicas, as quais inevitavelmente terão algum componente de inteligência artificial. Até para que a gente consiga ter os ganhos de escala, produtividade, precisão e efetividade que a gente precisa num mundo que nos desafia cada vez mais, né? Dito isso, a melhoria da qualidade regulatória no Brasil, hoje ela está institucionalizada. Deve passar aqui que eu esqueci da minha apresentação. Ela está institucionalizada como uma política pública. Então, os desafios para a melhoria regulatória apresentam os mesmos, né, desafios. E para cada etapa do ciclo regulatório, a gente consegue vislumbrar vários desafios que podem ser solucionados pelo uso de inteligência artificial. Então, eu vou contar aqui um pouco do nosso projeto piloto, passando pela contextualização, qual foi a motivação, qual foi o problema que a gente identificou, que a gente buscou a solução por inteligência artificial, o processo de construção e, por fim, as lições que ainda estamos aprendendo, já que estamos ainda terminando o piloto, né? Em 2023, a Secretaria de Competitividade e Política Regulatória se deparou com o desafio de implementar boas práticas regulatórias no Poder Executivo Federal. Então, nosso público seriam os reguladores. A gente deveria apoiar os reguladores a cumprir com algumas obrigações vigentes, obrigações legais. E ao mapear quem seriam esses reguladores na administração pública federal, nós identificamos 237 unidades administrativas. O nosso departamento conta com 15 pessoas, quando muito, que há uma rotatividade. Então, como que um departamento tão pequeno alcança 237 unidades administrativas? É óbvio que deveria passar por alguma solução tecnológica. Naquele momento, havia também a obrigação de se fazer análise de impacto regulatório, uma obrigação legal. Em 2024, foi feita uma auditoria com apenas 42 órgãos. Apenas 19 estavam fazendo análise de impacto regulatório. E desses 19 que fazem, poucos usam métodos quantitativos para analisar custos da regulação. Além disso, havia uma necessidade de a gente comunicar a política de melhoria regulatória com números. A gente precisava mostrar para a sociedade, para o setor produtivo, para os políticos, para a alta gestão, qual era o impacto de uma regulação mal elaborada. E não tínhamos esses números, não tínhamos esses dados. Então, surgiu a oportunidade de construir essa ferramenta com o apoio do BID, com o apoio de Portugal, que era justamente procurar uma solução que automatizasse a identificação, a classificação, a quantificação dos custos administrativos de forma que a gente pudesse promover melhores regulações. A metodologia foi a implementação de projetos pilotos para quantificar esses custos com o uso de inteligência artificial da Universidade Nova, ajustada para o cenário brasileiro. Como o cenário é grande, né, os setores são muitos, nós conseguimos filtrar ali e escolhemos, a partir de uma opção daqueles órgãos que tiveram interesse em participar, até porque há uma demanda de trabalho, né, para poder identificar as obrigações e os custos. Nós fizemos com o setor de telecom, com todas as empresas reguladas, até porque é um número limitado de empresas que estão no setor, e com o setor de petróleo e gás, restrito ao setor de biocombustíveis. A nossa ferramenta é um pouco similar ao que foi apresentado pela colega da Alemanha, mas é claro que aqui a gente tem as pitadas latinas de dificuldades, né, que a gente vai poder falar e compartilhar até com os colegas aí de outras regiões. A ferramenta ela consiste na apresentação de um documento, de um texto, né, normativo. Ele vai ser inserido ali no software de inteligência artificial e ele vai conseguir identificar as obrigações de informação que estão previstas na norma, detalhar as atividades administrativas que são requeridas para cumprir com essas obrigações e assim conseguir estimar os custos administrativos. E aqui a gente fala de custos administrativos, tem um erro no slide, administrative costs, there's a C, misplacing. Estimar os custos administrativos no modelo de custos padronizados, porque a gente também não consegue, para cada setor, ir profundamente nos custos envolvidos. O que foi, como funciona o sistema, né? Ele tem essa parte de dados anotados, que é onde a inteligência artificial vai conseguir identificar as obrigações e as atividades, e tem depois o componente da calculadora de custos, que a partir daquelas obrigações ele vai dizer qual o custo envolvido, quantas empresas são impactadas, quais os setores, quais são pequenas, micro, grandes empresas, vários números ali, que poderão ser utilizados no relatório de análise de impacto regulatório para comparação de alternativas. Então, a nossa motivação, diferente da experiência alemã, não era promover uma redução de custos, não era promover iniciativas de one in, one out, mas simplesmente oferecer ao regulador uma estimativa de custos envolvidos na proposta para que ele possa escolher a melhor alternativa regulatória. Como foi o trabalho das duas agências reguladoras, a Anatel, de telecom, a ANP, de biocombustíveis? A primeira tarefa foi identificar e separar quais seriam os setores, que eu mencionei que de telecom foram todas as empresas reguladas e no setor de petróleo e gás, biocombustíveis. A partir dali, pegar os atos administrativos, as normas que impunham regulações para esses setores e separar um grande número delas para alimentar a ferramenta. Depois disso, os reguladores tiveram o trabalho de anotar em cada uma dessas normas todos os dispositivos que indicavam uma obrigação de cumprimento, de informação ou de atividade administrativa. E aí vem a parte mais difícil. Quais são os custos? Onde estão os dados? Não tínhamos. Isso porque nós pegamos duas agências reguladoras muito experientes em boas práticas regulatórias, com muitos dados disponíveis, mas não tínhamos os custos administrativos que são impostos aos regulados. Então, trabalhamos com um questionário que puxa os custos administrativos padronizados, um questionário que foi elaborado por Portugal. A gente adaptou algumas questões para cada um dos setores e nós enviamos os questionários para todos os stakeholders que poderiam nos responder. Este foi o trabalho mais longo, nós não tivemos muitas respostas. Aqui é só um exemplo de quais seriam as obrigações de informação e as atividades administrativas, né? Obrigações de informação sobre tributos, necessidade de preencher formulários para licenças, liberações, certificações, autorizações, o processo de notificar a agência reguladora sobre alguma medida, submeter registros para conseguir algum apoio de governo, enfim, isso são exemplos do que seriam as obrigações de informação e as obrigações de atividades que incluem até mesmo tempos de espera, tempos para preenchimento de formulário, deslocamento, tudo isso deveria ser monetizado para os custos administrativos. E não sei se isso acontece na América Latina ou no mundo todo, mas a gente teve um problema de ser necessário construir confiança com os stakeholders para a gente conseguir essas informações. Porque, geralmente, quando o governo pede dados, as empresas ficam desconfiadas. Então, foi necessário todo um trabalho de sensibilização do governo federal com as associações, as entidades, o setor produtivo, de a gente, de forma transparente, explicar o que era o projeto, explicar qual era o objetivo, para que eles se sentissem confortáveis em passar os dados que a gente ainda não tinha. E aí, depois que eles nos mandaram algumas informações, a gente se deparou com informações que não estavam robustas o suficiente para alimentar a ferramenta. E aí, no final, houve uma decisão da gente utilizar os dados que foram usados em Portugal e a gente adaptar para o contexto brasileiro, por meio de taxa de câmbio, taxa de produtividade, salários. E agora, no último mês, a gente estava na parte de teste do piloto, para a gente identificar como o sistema funcionava, se havia erros ou algumas ineficiências. A gente retornou para a Universidade Nova os avanços que eram precisos fazer, e agora a gente está nessa fase final aí de fechamento. E aí é importante entender que, na identificação de erros, nessa fase de testes, a gente teve dos reguladores uma percepção de que a parte de identificar obrigações e atividades funciona muito bem, e ganha em produtividade em relação aos próprios reguladores quando eles vão procurar manualmente ali quais são as obrigações. A parte de custos, eles ainda se assustam, porque não tinha referência, então ninguém sabe dizer se aquele custo é verdadeiro ou não. Então, isso vai ser uma nova fase do piloto, onde a gente vai tentar aperfeiçoar essa base de dados de custos. Mas, então, o que a gente percebeu? E aí eu falo assim, dos desafios neste projeto específico. Ele foi longo e foi custoso. Ele foi longo e custoso pelas dificuldades que a gente teve de obter dados, mas não pelo uso da ferramenta. Foi no nosso processo e que agora a gente deve começar novos pilotos e a gente já sabe que a obtenção desses dados a gente vai precisar aperfeiçoar, né? Porque, aí, como disse o professor hoje na abertura do evento, a primeira coisa que a gente precisa ao trabalhar com uma ferramenta de inteligência artificial é ter dados disponíveis, e nós não tínhamos. Então, agora estamos trabalhando nisso. O sistema ele é escalável, mas a gente precisa trabalhar numa governança de como essa inteligência vai funcionar, para que a gente garanta uma escalabilidade com qualidade, a gente consiga fazer com que a ferramenta seja utilizada por todos os reguladores, que o público tenha confiança naqueles dados, e aí o público, eu digo, tanto os reguladores, que é o nosso público da coordenação da agenda, como a sociedade, e a gente tem a questão também da segurança de informação, que também foi trazida na experiência alemã, porque quando a gente coloca uma minuta de uma proposta legal na ferramenta, até que ela seja publicada, ela deveria ter um acesso restrito, então tem algumas preocupações de acesso. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, o que a gente viu que funcionou extremamente bem da ferramenta vai além do que era a nossa proposta inicial. A gente queria apenas dar dados para que fosse feita uma análise qualitativa e escolha de alternativas. Hoje a gente vê que a gente pode usar a ferramenta para processos de revisão de estoque regulatório, para processos de simplificação, para processos de redução de encargos, né? Esses encargos de obrigação, obrigações que estejam redundantes, desnecessárias, para uma simplificação administrativa. Então, acho que a ferramenta, a gente vê um potencial muito grande, e eu acho, mas a principal lição, que eu acho que é o que tem sido falado aqui desde hoje de manhã, é a necessidade de dados de qualidade. E aí a gente tem um problema na administração pública, que é justamente a falta de uma governança, uma política institucionalizada de governança de dados, para que os processos de coleta e tratamento de dados sejam sistemáticos, contínuos, estruturados. Né? Hoje a gente tem uma política nacional de governança de dados, mas ela ainda se relaciona muito com as áreas de tecnologia de informação dos órgãos. E quando a gente fala em melhoria de qualidade regulatória, melhoria de políticas públicas, e aí seja na forma tradicional que a gente fazia antes, seja com o uso de IA, a gente precisa da colaboração de todos os envolvidos para que aquilo realmente traga os efeitos esperados.
Muito obrigado, Sabrina. I'm sorry that I have to interrupt, is that we're running a little bit out of time for the questions, which I think so. Please, Dan, Catherine, if you can join us again. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for all. Please, yes. It's been amazing to hear from you and all these experiences. So we open the floor for questions. And of course, if there are any questions from the online audience, perhaps one of the students of Catherine wants to ask right now a question. Yeah, extra credit. Okay,
while they're thinking
go for it.
While people are thinking of a question, I just wanted to highlight one point that was on one of the slides from your excellent presentation that hasn't been talked about a lot today, and that's information security. And the importance of that, especially in a regulatory context, because there are adversaries and there are unscrupulous firms that will try to manipulate the regulatory system using AI. And if you don't build cybersecurity into the protocol at the base, and I think that that's just a really important observation, one that at every step of the way, it often doesn't get focused on, but it's critically important to long-term success.
Definitely. I think that also increases the trustworthiness of these projects, and of course, that people are thinking about using AI. Also, I wanted to ask you now, if we don't have any questions for now, probably what will be your one or two very much first actions you will recommend governments and regulators to start when they are thinking about using AI, from your experience? Yours, Dan, is public-private partnerships, because we needed also to discuss a little bit about that. But yes, just hearing from you, what would you recommend those regulators, especially those in Latin America that are hearing us right now and they are saying, okay, let's try to do something similar to what Brazil did. What should we be thinking as priorities? I'll start like this, Dan, if that's okay, and then, of course, finish there.
Yeah, I think that's going to vary based on the context and maturity of the government. And so that's across Latin America and the Caribbean, that's going to be different. But I'd say that, wherever you are in your maturity in terms of the regulatory process overall, start there and start small. And don't think about, we have to start with the perfect module across all of the different opportunities. Find a module that fits in the setting of your government. It might be developing a particular economic analysis to do a rule. It might be setting up a comment structure because you have lots of different types of public comments coming into a final rule. And then apply a model that can work in that setting and learn from that. It gets back a little bit to the agile point that I made earlier, which is it's context specific about where to start, but start small. Wherever you start, don't try to think about solving the entire regulatory structure or addressing all of the issues we've raised here in the panel and all day, but think about solving one particular issue and then moving from there.
So this might be somewhat duplicative, but I was going to say one thing that I learned from going in and talking in a variety of agencies is one, the heterogeneity, and thinking the kind of hammer and nail image was meant seriously because different agencies, one of the things that retrospective review, some agencies said this would be a great place to utilize because this is a good governance, high value process. We're supposed to go back and look at regulations and see where there are problems, but it's low priority in our cash-strapped, resource-strained agency. And so its use here isn't going to substitute for other high priority things or upend workflows. It's only going to enhance our ability to do this task, which we otherwise wouldn't do. So I think that like identifying really difficult challenges, or think about the Department of Defense. They had a really difficult challenge. They had these, I didn't mention to you, these mounds of policy documents. It would take people several days to research the different things. And now they can query this data set in seconds to get these answers. And they've estimated the savings, et cetera. So thinking deeply about the kinds of problems that might be suited to the technology. And then the second is, and again, it's consistent, I think, building off of what Dan said, is someone in the FDA really impacted me a lot by saying, you have to be able to pilot these technologies and be able to fail cheaply. You have to be able to fail. It's trial and error. So we at the FDA, we're not going to go out into the public and fail and have lives lost. We're going to have an incubator and be testing technology. We looked at, David mentioned something about data in one place being transferred to a very different setting. In the FDA, they talked about really controlled experiments that they thought they tested, and then they got some real world data and started in a small way, and it did dramatically different things. So that's being responsible, but you have to, the kind of fear, in some sense, I agree with you that there can be over-enthusiasm for AI, but sometimes within governmental agencies, there can be, really difficult risk aversion and this fear, especially legal fear. Some of the people I talked to about using the tool for notice and comment said, but if we aren't able to comment on every single comment that comes in and we miss one, we'll be sued. And I said, where's that administrative law requirement? That's not the requirement at all. So understanding, within context and piloting, starting small, being able to fail, but then all the while building internal capacity. Because I think we've heard that as a theme throughout too, that, and I don't mean this by way that everyone within the agency has to be an expert. Building internal capacity means getting a kind of facility. I've been in the room with people and able to talk to them about legal implications of technologies that I wouldn't be able to adequately explain, et cetera. So you can do kind of collaborative so that the regulators understand. You don't have to give them the model and the code, but they have to understand basically what the problem is and how the technology is going to help to solve it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this I like this entrepreneurial spirit also of failing, starting small. Perhaps before we hear from others, Paula, you have a question also?
I do have a question for you, Catherine, on the topic of rate of litigation, right? This is supposed to diminish the rate of litigation because you're supposed to have better decisions and more standardized decisions. I don't know if you have actually seen that in the cases that you have studied, and I have a general questions for all of you guys regarding the public perception of the use of AI, right? Sometimes I feel that we're really, really concerned about understanding and making transparent what's the process, what's the algorithm, what is taken into account. But we don't do that with public officials. We have no clue what's in their minds, right? So I feel that there is an imbalance expectation for transparency with AI that we do not have in a non-AI, more standard procedures within the public sector. I would like to know if there is a positive public perception of the use of AI, or if you have found that is way more controversial than that.
Excellent. So I don't know who would like to start. If you would like, Daniel, and then perhaps we hear from Catherine. Yep. Yeah, so Daniel, let's go.
Just on this question about maybe double standards, about we hold officials to different standards than we hold AI. One important thing to remember there is we have to be careful to understand what exceptional function these technologies are playing. And that's to say, these are cognitive surrogates that are acting in the world without at the same time having the same mechanisms of accountability and responsibility as you and I have, because they're not moral agents, they're not legal agents, right? This is why there's a higher burden placed upon those technologies to have mechanisms for transparency and equity and fairness. It's precisely because we are offloading our moral and legal competences and agencies onto the technology. So I think we have to be careful not to fall into whataboutism. So there's people who talk about, well, what about the way that humans are biased? And what about the way that humans are intransparent? Well, actually, it's a categorical difference between the way we're treating the algorithm and we treat the human.
Dan, can I interrupt you? Because I think at the end of the day, there's always a civil servant that's going to deliver the decision and that's going to be held accountable, right? It's using a different tool, but at the end of the day, there's some person that's going to be accountable, because you cannot delegate your responsibility as a civil service. And I have the heart of a civil servant because I have been there for many, many years, right? So just to interrupt you, sorry.
Yeah, please, Catherine. And there is a question from one of your students. So,
oh,
yeah.
okay.
So
I actually think one thing that you just said that I want to echo, because it's often missed, is like AI is a tool. So sometimes people talk in this way as if AI is something other. There are people in the academy, and maybe they're preparing for a future where we have fully agentic AI, and we have to try to figure out moral culpability or legal accountability of an AI agent. But I don't think those are the questions that are relevant here. I think it's that AI is a tool, and I think that the frameworks in the United States, the administrative law and the civil liability frameworks, are being designed to hold those actors and decision makers who are using this tool in ways that lead to harms accountable. Now, it's difficult. There's an ALI project. The American Law Institute has a new project on civil liability for AI. I told you at the outset that I'm in the regulatory side and the civil liability side, and there are already cases in our system. There are companies that have created things like companion AI. There are autonomous vehicles that are crashing. We already, in our legal liability system, are finding ways. And when people say things like the black box and the opacity prevents the tort system, it's untrue, right? It's muddled the way our common law system is, but judges are figuring out frameworks, and some are holding things responsible under like a products liability model, some under others. So I am with you that it's a tool, and that we can have frameworks. Administrative law, I mean, we alluded to this quite quickly. Dan talked sweepingly and very comprehensively about the rulemaking process. Rules can be challenged. Now, back to your initial question, we don't have existing challenges to rules that have used AI because their use case in rulemaking, fully deployed rules is really small. The rule I talked about, the cleanup initiative, is the only rule I'm aware of that actually is a final rule that used an AI tool. That one didn't require a lot of transparency because it was doing cleanup. But in a rule, for example, where a regulator had used it as the basis of their cost-benefit analysis and had disclosed that in the notice of proposed rulemaking, there'd have to be, if that rule gets challenged, a way for them to explain, give reasons giving, even if it's not technical explainability, reasons why the regulators relied upon that in passing the particular rule. And a judge would have to weigh in on that. So to me, that's where the attention should be, not in kind of existential debates about should we go there or not. The private sector is going there. I mentioned before, there are hundreds now, probably it's up to thousands of AI-embedded medical devices. We need regulatory frameworks that are able, probably shifting their resources from ex ante to ex post, feedback loops and the like. That's what we need to be thinking about, in my opinion.
The other thing I'd say is we need the use case inventories that we've talked about today. We need to think about them in a risk communication framework, right? If you have, sort of autonomous vehicles is a good example. You've got a city where there's autonomous vehicles. They may have a much lower accident rate than people who drive cars, but every time there's an accident with an autonomous vehicle, it gets into the press because there's not a basis for comparison that's fact-based about that use. So if you think about in a regulatory setting, if you, in terms of it may be that an AI can enable, if it's properly drawn, if the model is drawn with respect to bias mitigation and accuracy of data and stuff, that it can reduce bias in decision making. We've actually have a report that was done for our center a few years ago at AI used for prosecutorial charging decisions, and that the result was actually less biased than when people did it. So, but that has to be communicated. People have to understand it so that when they hear about the problem, and there will be a problem, they have a context for, yes, there's a problem, but we know there may be, as long as we design it properly with ethics and responsibility in mind, those problems may be less than in a non-AI scenario, again, if done properly.
Excellent. With that, I just want to say that the idea of this panel was to have a discussion on AI and regulatory design. I think we had it. It was amazing. We learned a lot. We learned a lot about cost identification and the ex post and ex ante analysis. I have to say there are many more uses, that there are many other features from AI that especially can be used for AI design, and that basically we're starting with cost identification and allocation, but probably we're going to see many more in the near future. And we have been doing this research, and I say we because I have been supporting the Inter-American Development Bank on looking into this agenda and how to work in it. And I've been looking into your research for that purpose, and also in the case of Brazil especially. So thank you, because it is a privilege to hear from you, to exchange these ideas, and I think that is going to be extremely helpful, not only for the bank, but for many of the countries that work with the bank and are going to develop this agenda. Please, Catherine. Yeah, it's a question on human rights, ethical and human rights concerns, and regulatory design in Latin America. So I think very much we answered that. Again, thank you for this. Thank you for your participation, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Armando, for your moderation.
We will now begin our final panel for the day, AI for supervision and enforcement. Here, we will explore the use of AI in supervision processes, early detection, risk analysis, and strengthening the institutional capacity of regulatory agencies. It is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Flor de Luz Guadalupe Hernández Barrios, General Director of Prevention of Operations with Illicitly Sourced Funds at the National Banking and Securities Commission of Mexico, Billy Escobar Perez, Superintendent at the Superintendency of Companies of Colombia, and Simone Di Castri, CEO and co-founder of the Digital Transformation Solutions and Cambridge Subtech Lab, and our moderator, Anderson Caputo Silva, Division Chief of the Connectivity, Markets, and Finance Division, Institutions for Development Department here at the IDB. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. Please gather your questions. Anderson, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for this introduction. And as you have heard, we have an amazing panel because we're going to be having two country experiences from different angles. No? And then we also have Simone here with an excellent presentation that I have seen the slides, super rich the debate. So we look forward for that just as an additional way on how we are planning to do this. Each one will have a presentation of about 15, 20 minutes that I'll be keeping track of it with a very a quick follow-up question that I have for them, but that I'm going to already do the spoiler here. Having this event in the IDB and how important this whole agenda it is for us, it's critical to, as we we listen to these presentations, is always in our head, what could we do more, no? As an IDB, etc. So it's the same question to all of you from the different angles that you're going to be presenting. So that's the follow-up question that we have right after you, when you're wrapping up and finishing your presentation. And then in the end, we are going to have the Q&A. No? So with that in place, and also we thought about the sequence here of starting with the overview and the very rich data statistics that Simone has in his hands. Now to start with him, and then we go into the country-specific cases with Flo first, and then Billy talking about Colombia. Okay, so let's start. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Simone.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Hi. Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Also is not in the room with us and is online. It's really a pleasure to be back in the plaza this year again, and to share with you some of our work and to learn also from the experiences of the other speakers. So I do have a few slides, and the goal is to set the stage for the conversation using some of the data from our annual survey, the State of SupTech report, in order to understand like where countries are at in terms of implementation of AI, but also some of the challenges, really understanding more of the journey. Don't see the slides yet, and there we are. And before going into those data, I want to share a little bit also about our broader work and some of the lessons that we have been able to learn from the different projects that we are implementing. So we work across what we call TA in terms of transformational advisory, not only technical assistance, applications development, so the incubation of new solutions that are AI-powered, training and leadership growth, research insights, and ecosystem acceleration. And throughout this work, we have been training just in the last 3 years, for example, over 1,500 people working on supervisory authorities, whether they are supervisors, examiners, data scientists, people in the board, so across the organizations to really create this culture and make them see the opportunities for transformation throughout the organization. Through this work, we have developed in the last 3 years 517 use case diagnostics, and a survey of the people we have trained show that 50% of the capstones they developed through the trainings within 18 months became either a prototype or a live solution, which is pretty astonishing in terms of an investment in training, which usually is thought to be only for knowledge, but the knowledge become really a practical asset for the agency to take it into development, to have live solutions that are available to them and to their colleagues. So this is our footprint, and I want to share a few insights from a few descriptions of this project that we've been working on. And you see Latin America is very well represented. The Americas in general have been a regional focus for our work. For example, I had the privilege, the honor to work on the digital transformation strategy for the New York State Department of Financial Services. Currently, as we speak, the Superintendencia of Bancos de Panama and of Dominican Republic are using our tools to do a self-diagnostic, and then they're gonna work with us on the strategy development for SupTech and AI. Recently, we also moved beyond SupTech. And so maybe I should say SupTech means supervisory technology, is the branch of GovTech that it's something probably everybody is more familiar with, that is specific to financial authorities, central banks, consumer securities commissions from all around the world. So for example, in the Philippines recently, we were asked to take the Internet Transaction Act, which mandates for all e-commerce to create a unified platform across the government for consumer protection, for those people who in the country have encountered some challenges in the experience with vendors, in the experience through their journey in the e-commerce world. Like, what do they do? traditionally they need to go to, they need to figure out even what is the agency that can address help them to house one of their complaints or receive support. So the Internet Transaction Act says that this is no longer the case, that there should be one entry point, one single case management system across all the government, and so a different way to treat consumers, which I think makes absolutely sense. So we had to work with 26 government agencies in the Philippines to understand how they were treating complaints, what was their system, manual, some semi-manual, some had some automation, how the new system would integrate into their data sets, and made them to agree to have a single platform, so a single architecture, one design, and everybody to co-sign a project charter, so a full specification ready for the RFP. So 26 agencies usually takes quite some time. With the methodology that we have developed, from the moment we made the first email for the project to the moment all the agencies signed off the project charter, it was only 3 months. It's really possible to advance these services, to advance this thinking, and to break silos within the agencies, but also across agencies, across the full government, so that we can start exploring solutions that can work not only for one organizations, but really can scale at the national level and then regional and of course international. So that's the goal of the example. In terms of training related to AI, we have a lot of interest from AI experts, but also from just supervisors, just other employees that they want to understand the language of data, they want to understand the language of AI. So for example, we have a course called Practical Data Science, where people who have known nothing about data science, by the end, in 6 weeks, they are able to work with their AI experts, at least to have the bespoke dialogue and to start using the same glossaries and to understanding how to work together. The AI boot camps also that we do have the same goal. Getting into the solutions. So these are some examples of solutions we have developed. And when I say developed, it means we have participated in designing, doing the strategy, the POC, design the architecture, de-risking the engagement between the public agency and vendors or development shops. So our goal is to be a bridge between the public sector and their own IT teams or the IT experts that are out in the world and ready to provide services to them. So some examples are, for example, 10 years ago, we built the first chatbot used by central bank, a new case management system that was AI-powered for the Central Bank of the Philippines. And it was beautiful because the challenge there 10 years ago was to find a language model that speaks Taglish, the language of the people. They don't speak only Tagalog, they don't speak only English, they bring it together, they mix it. Of course, the model didn't exist at that time, maybe now it does. But in only 3 months, the software was able to learn from to mix Tagalog and English and to speak the language of the people. And Bob, which is the name of the chatbot of the central bank, receives now thousands and processes thousands of complaints every year from the people in the Philippines, both from the cities and from the rural areas. So it's been a tool for the democratization of consumer protection in the country. The example of topic modeling and sentiment analysis is, I think, very interesting in terms of AI deployment, because this is a completely new data set. It's not about how we transform an analogic process or an Excel file or an Access file into something more digital and create more efficiency. This is really accessing completely new data. So now the central banks are able to analyze in real time what is the dialogue in the social media, in the web, to understand if there are signals of possible incoming frauds, incoming bubbles. And so there have been many experiments, for example, to apply this to be able to see through possible mortgage market bubbles, possible issues around prudential supervision, and a lot, of course, around consumer protection, Ponzi schemes, and so forth and so on. And so the OJK, for example, in Indonesia, is now deploying this technology across all the supervisory departments, and a number of other agencies are doing the same. With the Reserve Bank of India, we developed an app to be able to screen through app stores to identify any fintech app that has not been approved or that is not applying fully the law and take it down right away.
And then there is a number of API-based solutions. And that's important because as exciting it is to talk about artificial intelligence, it is even more exciting to talk about AI readiness. AI readiness is key. And AI readiness means data governance, data management, data collection, data processing. And that's where APIs, I think, are really the most important infrastructural piece these days that we need to invest on in order to change and transform the collection and the validation, very importantly, of the data. So we did an experiment, for example, with the CMBV. And of all these solutions, it's the only one that is still a prototype and not fully deployed. So there is a really high level of success in terms of these solutions becoming real live for the agencies. And in the solution developed with the CMBV, it was for money laundering supervision. So we train the machine learning algorithms using some of the historical data, and just through deploying the new software across 1 year of data from 2 banks in the country, the algorithm was available to find 25% additional dimensions that were invisible of the human eyes, but were consistent with the methodologies that the supervisors say we're using. So they were able to really see 25% more correlations that are useful to flag where there is a suspicious transaction. And through that, if that was fully deployed, the supervisor of the CMBV had predicted that from realizing 1 inspection in 3 to 5 weeks, they will be able to do 1 inspection, 1 examination in 3 to 5 days. Because now all the data will come through API, machine learning will identify where to really look and focus. This is key because it brings to life risk-based supervision, and with scarce resources and bigger mandates, this is really what we need to do. We need to complement the knowledge of humans with the tools of technology. A few data from here, and I will go fast because I've used a lot of time for the first part. So this is a survey that we do every year. Last year was 139 financial authorities from 100 countries all over the world and 23 solution providers. The 2025 report will be available in 2 weeks. So what we found is really like, this is what financial authorities are using. It's still, this is a AI maturity index. 1, low maturity, 5, high maturity. And of course, artificial intelligence is in the 4G and 5G, in predictive analytics and other technologies. So this is what they're using, but they're super clear about the trajectory and where they want to go. Like so often I hear about like, yeah, but they don't understand the opportunity, but the culture, there is resistance. Like what we see is that they are eager to advance toward new technologies adoption and to do the digital transformation. Problem is like, how do we get from here? How do we support their journey to get from here to there? And we see that AI is still like very, very niche. Like only 10% of our surveyed agencies have deployed already AI. However, 60% are already experimenting with it. So definitely it's in their pipeline. They're ready to receive the support that we can provide. We also see right away, very early in the days, already divide between advanced economies and emerging economies. And we have this type of slides for each single data in the report, but I think it's particularly important to bring it in the context of a multilateral regional development bank. There is work to do for that divide to shrink and not to become deeper. And what are the challenges that they report? Well, first of all, poor data quality. It's a real one. And then the problem, of course, of integrating AI with existing system and workflows, as well as concerns around data protection, privacy, and the lack of real governance. And I will stop here with like the black box, the explainability. So this is what is on top of their mind, where they're like really getting concerned about getting into AI. And an important piece of data is also that they report not having the right ethical frameworks to work with AI in place. What they say is like, there are so many ethical frameworks around the world, but not single one that really adapts to like how do, like for financial authorities and more in general also for many similar public agencies. So something that we need as a community of researchers, academics and everything else to adjust to make it available more readily to the financial authorities. How they are doing, how they execute on this mandate to take more tech and more AI for supervision. Well, they're still in two legacy models, which are the fully centralized or fully decentralized. And where we see more impact, where we see the agencies that have more maturity and more capacity, what they're doing is they're taking an hub and spoke model. And so we will see hub and spoke model hopefully growing, but it's also an area of support to go from strategy to execution through the right organizational models. And in terms of, we talked a lot about skills this morning. So what skills they have and what skills they're missing. In terms of skills that they have, they're still like the more traditional in terms of statistical data mining technique and running scripts on spreadsheets and shells. What is important to me is like what they're asking for, what they're demanding. And we see that the top of the tech bar where there is more demand is still to have people with skills on Python, cloud computing, business intelligence. And generative AI, it's really not on top of their mind. Thank God, I would say. I'm so relieved when I see this because it means that they're doing the background work to be ready for AI, to put in order the data, to do all the data governance and data management and infrastructural work that is critical. I was a little bit concerned this year about, with all the hype on generative AI, that we will see these percentages starting to flip. And I think it's correct. And what you notice also through all the experiments that we're doing, through all the solutions that we developed, is that in many cases, an agency goes ahead, we experiment with a very advanced AI solution, like the one with CMBV, and that's fantastic because it gives them an opportunity to get their end into AI, into advanced tech, and to look back and say, okay, now we go back. Now we get ready. And getting ready means, in particular, having strategies in place. So the data from this year show a very clear correlation between having in place a subtech data governance or digital transformation strategy and an increase in solution deployed. And I don't have the chart here, but the data are in the report, a drastic decrease in terms of challenges faced. So the more I have a strategy in place, the more as an institution, I'm breaking silos, I'm creating culture, I'm giving direction, providing the teams with the right budgets, with the right assets that they need to do the work. And so following the challenges, increasing the effectiveness of these efforts with more applications deployed. Good news. Many of these strategies are there and many others are in development. So there is a lot of activity from that point of view as we speak in financial agencies around the world. And I think this is the last slide with numbers and closing a minute and a half. But like also part of the readiness, of course, is cloud computing, and there are still big concerns around adopting cloud, something that needs to be considered, taken care of. Particularly from the point of view of the security and data protection concerns and also integration and costs. So last two things, what we're doing about this. Scalability is the problem, and traditional consulting model, traditional donor models, traditional ways we have been working to date don't work in today's world. There is so much demand from public agencies, there are so many needs and so much eagerness really to do this work that we need to scale. And so for us to scale, what we are offering to the community of GovTech is GovSpace, which is a platform that we're launching in 2 weeks, which will be able, with many tools and features for free, for all public agencies, for all partners, where we can come together and collaborate and find spaces, digitalize our communities of practice, feed them with the tools that we have. And so that's how, for example, I just say, Dominican Republic and Panama are doing a free diagnostic because these tools are available in the platform, which includes a number of tools, including, and I know this is overwhelming, but there is also a data sandpit where they can test code, test solutions from the vendors, design together with collaboratively with other partners and agencies, so that they have a full testing environment without integrating into the live environment and putting them at risk. There is agentic AI supporting them in the platform. There is a RAG that analyzes at the moment about 20,000 knowledge products, pieces of code, case studies, and other things that are recommended depending on the tax choices. So a very rich environment for collaboration and for acceleration of this journey. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Simone. And thank you for being on time too, like a perfect timing. Now, I take a few points from your presentation, especially when you started, you said of the great value of investments in training, no, and how this translated in actual implementation. That was a very rich part. I think you mentioned another thing that is and thank you for flagging that and looking at this, which is this divide between like emerging markets and the developed economies now, and that I look forward to looking more detailed the other data, but it was clear that there is a divide there in place that we need to look at it, and then also your part on the challenges of deployment, no? The availability of data, and the need for integration, etc. So if you were to really highlight how we would be. It seems that there is a whole holistic approach that you need to do. No? There are many different areas to tackle. No? But if you were to cite a few ones that we should be putting as priorities in our engagement as multilaterals, which ones would that be?
Thank you so much for the. So I had 20 minutes for the presentation. I hope I have 1 hour to answer your question now, because it is complex, but in a minute probably. I don't think we're lacking experimentation in any of the regions of the world. In Latin America, there's so much going on. There are so many interesting projects, very advanced, incredible skilled people. I think what we're lacking is a strategy for scalability. And so, for example, regional scale-out facilities where, and there is an advantage in this region of a certain level of conformity of the language, which of course in the AI world, it's an advantage in terms of creating language models. We have more opportunity for peer learning. So possibly using GovSpace to bring the community and to start sharing across agencies, across countries, code, data, even skill sets. Like, you know, there could be frictional roles that are used across different agencies to help advance, because some of these skills are very scarce in the market. And so we need to think about how to upskill people and also how to put them in a systemic, in a framework where they do have the tools and where there is a pathway for adoption of these technologies. So from the strategy, from the training, then like how do we really bring all these things to life? I think that we have learned enough and we can do so much together to support the agencies.
Well, no, thank you very much, and we look forward to expanding during the Q&A. No? Let me pass to Flor, to also, we have very interesting sites that I have seen about the experience in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will take advantage for the translation, and I will perform my presentation in Spanish and maybe the Q&A in English. So something happened with the presentation, but it's okay. I could do it with this. Yeah. Bueno, en la Comisión Nacional Bancaria de Valores de México realizamos la supervisión del sector financiero, y una de las cosas más importantes de decir en el sector financiero es que se basa en la confianza. Eso fue desde hace siglos, eso permanece ahora también. ¿Por qué decimos esto? Porque una de las cosas que hay que tener en consideración cuando hablamos de inteligencia artificial, y ya lo han mencionado muchas veces, es la gobernanza de datos, pero también la confidencialidad de ellos. Nosotros, los supervisores financieros, tenemos acceso a datos personales de los clientes de las instituciones financieras, fechas de transacciones, montos. Inclusive podemos hacer redes de vínculos en las cuales nosotros podemos saber quiénes son sus pares comerciales, a qué lugares fueron, a qué hora. Entonces, por esa situación es muy importante tener en mente que se debe tener una perfecta seguridad de datos, y aunque en México todavía no hay una ley, digamos, a nivel nacional o federal que haga una regulación en relación con el uso de datos y la inteligencia artificial, sí tenemos una regulación bastante amplia, de hecho de las primeras del mundo en protección de datos personales, muy robusta, que nos ha permitido entonces llevar a cabo también nuestras acciones de supervisión con esto. Una vez dicho esto, pues esto es muy importante porque hay dos tipos de supervisión, digamos, a nivel financiero. La llamada supervisión prudencial y la supervisión antilavado de dinero y contra el financiamiento del terrorismo. La supervisión prudencial básicamente se basa en poder tener a las instituciones financieras con los niveles de capitalización necesarios para que puedan seguir operando y los recursos del público se encuentren adecuadamente asegurados y no de repente vaya a salir algo que haga una disrupción y entonces quiebre alguna institución financiera. Pero cuando hablamos de supervisión antilavado de dinero, lo que realmente queremos decir es que buscamos que recursos de origen ilícito, es decir, procedentes de algún delito, particularmente asociado al lavado de dinero, que son los más, siempre son los delitos graves en las sociedades, como lo es narcotráfico, tráfico de personas, armas, tráfico de armas. Entonces, básicamente lo que tratamos de evitar es, más bien lo que buscamos evitar es que este dinero de origen ilícito pueda entrar al sistema financiero. Entonces, por eso, para eso, realizamos una intensiva análisis de datos y por eso es que iba a la primera parte relacionado con la protección de datos, porque nosotros tenemos acceso a todos esos datos para poder determinar efectivamente si es que presuntamente algún recurso de origen ilícito ha entrado al sistema financiero y entonces poder empezar a cortar esos flujos. Porque una vez que se cortan los flujos, lo que se presume es que también le estás cortando la actividad a las personas que introdujeron eso. Para eso, tradicionalmente nos hemos basado en ciertos métodos, como lo puede ser la recolección de datos, desde métodos muy, digamos, rudimentarios, como puede ser bases de datos en Excel, hasta poder interactuar con lo que ahora conocemos como trazabilidad de datos, que lo hacemos básicamente con el monitoreo, algunas herramientas Subtech y algunas otras herramientas de las que les hablaré más adelante. Y justamente nosotros estamos en este periodo en el que buscamos hacer una transición, porque para nosotros lo más importante es poder hacer una determinación de estos flujos ilícitos antes de que empiecen a permear más en el sistema financiero, porque rápidamente, como sucede el lavado de dinero, es en 3 etapas y una de estas se llama estratificación, que es la segunda, que consiste, los criminales lo que hacen es montar sobre una capa de transacción, otra capa de transacción financiera y otra y otra y otra para que el rastro se vaya perdiendo. Es decir, lo que originalmente pudo haber entrado como el pago de un préstamo, después ese préstamo se vuelve a capitalizar y entonces solicito otro préstamo y otro y después voy a apostar al casino y después regresa ese dinero y entonces es como se empiezan a montar estas capas. Por eso es que para nosotros es muy importante ir haciendo la disección para eventualmente, cuando se llegue a judicializar un caso, efectivamente se pueda comprobar que estos recursos vienen de algún tipo de ilícito. Entonces, finalmente, nosotros hemos realizado una adopción de la inteligencia artificial, pero basado en ciertas cuestiones preliminares. Y la primera, que sería muy importante mencionar, y es algo que también constantemente se ha mencionado a lo largo de este foro, es la capacitación, ¿no? El capacity building, la formación de capacidades que es necesaria, porque aunque uno pueda pensar que la inteligencia artificial va a dar un primer resultado de inmediato, no es verdad. Para poder obtener el resultado que uno está buscando, se utilizan preguntas, los llamados prompts, Y a través de estos prompts es que se van obteniendo ciertos resultados. Sin embargo, cuando uno analiza el resultado, el primer resultado no es lo que uno esperaba. Entonces, tiene que meter más información, tiene que repreguntar, y a través del machine learning se le va diciendo a la máquina, bueno, a ver, pero ¿por qué me dijiste esto? Este resultado no es así. Esto puede llevar bastantes semanas. No es una tarea que se pueda hacer en una sola sesión, algo que yo vaya solamente a poner un documento, y no es así. Se tiene que tomar bastante tiempo, pero para esto también hay que capacitar a las personas. Es más, el tema es bastante empírico, porque quien lo hace es una sola persona. En mi caso, por ejemplo, para poder llegar a ciertos resultados, yo soy la que tuvo que hacer estas calibraciones para poder después diseminar la información y, bueno, pues poder aplicarlo. Por otro lado, también hacer un enfoque responsable, porque aquí viene la otra parte importante. Cuando uno utiliza la inteligencia artificial y mete estos datos, y más que datos también los documentos, tiene que ser consciente de que los resultados tiene uno que supervisarlos. No puede uno confiarse necesariamente a que la estructura lógica de la inteligencia artificial va a dar el resultado que uno está esperando, porque no es así. Entonces, uno tiene que asumir siempre la responsabilidad de verificar los resultados que se están dando por la inteligencia artificial, para además saber si es lo que necesitamos utilizar, por ejemplo, para comprobar una hipótesis, porque como supervisora en materia antilavado lo que hago es trabajar a veces bajo hipótesis. Esta transacción me resulta sospechosa, entonces probablemente es que esta persona puede estar asociada con otra. Ese tipo de hipótesis son las que yo necesito ir comprobando, pero la inteligencia artificial no me va a dar necesariamente los resultados. Yo tengo que siempre estar verificando esa información. Por otro lado, también es muy importante determinar para qué quiero utilizar a la inteligencia artificial, porque no es nada más como un juego que uno está intentando discernir para qué la quiero usar. No. Nuevamente volvemos al tema de las hipótesis. Entonces yo pienso, por ejemplo, a través del uso de la inteligencia artificial, meto ciertos datos con otros datos comprobados o dados por el Banco Mundial o el Grupo de Acción Financiera Internacional o cualquier otra institución reconocida en el medio, y me va a dar esto, ¿no? Yo necesito saber para qué la estoy usando, para que entonces a partir de eso yo pueda generar mis hipótesis y posteriormente llegar a la comprobación de las mismas. Y en ese sentido, entonces, nuevamente volvemos a cerrar el círculo y se trata de reforzar capacidades, básicamente, sobre todo a nivel supervisores. Entonces, nosotros, para poder llegar a esta determinación, tenemos lo que le llamamos la arquitectura SUBTEC, de la cual Simone ya nos ha dado una muy buena introducción. No quisiera abundar mucho más en esto, pero para poder llegar a los resultados que nosotros estamos esperando y poder tener un adecuado uso de la SUBTEC asociado a la inteligencia artificial, lo que tuvimos que hacer es montar grupos multidisciplinarios, porque no es lo mismo la perspectiva legal que la perspectiva financiera, que la perspectiva contable y que el tema de un economista o un informático. Entonces son equipos multidisciplinarios los que nos van robusteciendo este entendimiento y que siempre nos van a poder aportar algo para el entendimiento final. Por otro lado, también, como les decía, la inteligencia artificial me va a dar a mí bastantes cosas. Sin embargo, no necesariamente va a llegar al tipo de aproximación que requiero de inicio. Me voy a tratar de explicar, les pongo un ejemplo. Digamos que yo estoy tratando de monitorear cuentas que transaccionen menos de $1,000 al mes, cuentas que sean utilizadas por mujeres jóvenes, no mayores de 26 años y que se encuentren en ciertas municipalidades del territorio mexicano. ¿Esto por qué? Por un tema de trata de personas probablemente. La primera aproximación de cómo es el comportamiento general de estas cuentas y cómo transaccionan estas personas en el sistema financiero, en lo común, no me lo da la inteligencia artificial, me lo da otra cosa que se llama el I2 de IBM o otro producto que se llama IDEA. A través de esto yo voy haciendo patrones de comportamiento y puedo sacar estadísticas de cómo en un común se comporta una mujer de 26 años viviendo, por ejemplo, en el estado de Sinaloa durante un mes, una mujer soltera. Si entonces mis patrones de conducta se van saliendo de esto, entonces yo ya empiezo a ver una inusualidad. Pues sí, es una mujer de Sinaloa, menor de 26 años, pero resulta que transacciona cada martes y jueves y está mandando $300 a Guatemala. Y no tiene familia en Guatemala. ¿Cómo? Porque estaría enviando ese dinero. Y ahí es cuando ya empieza, pero eso no me lo da de origen la inteligencia artificial. Me lo dan estas otras dos herramientas, que sí eventualmente me puede ayudar la inteligencia artificial cuando yo ya descubra esos patrones. Entonces, poder nuevamente meter esa información y que la inteligencia artificial empiece a detectar cuántos patrones de esos en cuántas cuentas bancarias hay. Pero nuevamente, eso tuvo que ser por medio de la aplicación de otras herramientas. Otra cosa que es sumamente importante para estas arquitecturas y el uso de tecnología de información asociada de inteligencia artificial asociada a SubTech es la recolección de datos. Y que esta recolección de datos sea similar o muy similar en todas las instituciones financieras. Por lo tanto, yo soy, o más bien la comisión, las supervisores, somos los que tenemos que determinar qué tipo de datos, cuál es la cualidad de los datos, la calidad de estos datos, cuál es la frecuencia en cual me la tienen que enviar, y todo esto montado en una misma infraestructura, porque si no, lo que va a suceder es que cuando yo quiera realizar los cruces de datos, esto no va a ser viable. Por tanto, en volver a rehacer estas bases de datos, en volver a generarlas para tener la calidad necesaria me va a llevar tiempo, que es el tiempo que ya se supone que iba a ahorrarme con la inteligencia artificial. Por eso esa parte de la recolección de datos es sumamente valiosa y ha sido mencionada ya muchas veces a lo largo de esta conferencia. Entonces, precisamente, pues los fundamentos para el uso de una inteligencia o de la inteligencia artificial dentro de los supervisores es el fomento de capacidades, la recolección de datos, poder utilizar reportes y dashboards. Eso es lo que a nosotros nos va a dar un control de todo lo que podemos realizar a través de la inteligencia artificial. Entonces, como les decía, nosotros específicamente, ¿para qué estamos utilizando? Otra cosa importante que se me olvidó decirles. En la Comisión Nacional Bancaria de Valores, como les decía, los datos que nosotros tenemos son altamente confidenciales, sensibles, personales, y tenemos que cuidar tanto la protección de datos y, grosso modo, los derechos humanos en relación con esto y de los clientes. Lo que hizo la Comisión fue desarrollar su propia inteligencia artificial, se llama ARIA. Y entonces a través de ARIA sí que nosotros ya podemos empezar a subir esta información que no podríamos subir en otras soluciones comerciales por el tema de confidencialidad. El único tema es que como está digamos, respaldada por un machine learning, entonces nuevamente somos nosotros los que tenemos que empezar a enseñarle para que entonces pueda sacar los resultados a mediano plazo que nosotros estamos esperando. Entonces la utilizamos en primer lugar para poder determinar si el acercamiento o la calibración de riesgos que realizan las entidades de su situación o sus vulnerabilidades en materia de lavado de dinero es adecuada. Esta calibración es altamente técnica, es algo que se hace entre materia PLD, pero también tiene que ver con las áreas de riesgo, que son áreas típicamente matemáticas, que son las que realizan estos cálculos. También la utilizamos para la revisión de documentos y esto créanme que nos ha sido sumamente útil porque el cumplimiento regulatorio en un punto tiene que ver con datos que se alojan en documentos. Por tanto, a ese sí es mucho más rápido y fácil preguntar a la inteligencia artificial, dime este artículo de esta ley, ¿dónde se encuentra plasmado en estos documentos? Y entonces ya se saca, se comprueba, pero ese trabajo sí que nos ha disminuido en bastante tiempo, de 2 semanas que lo vaciamos, ahora puede ser 2 días o 3 días. Los análisis de redes, y aquí es donde viene una parte muy interesante. Básicamente, cuando nosotros ya tenemos comprobado cómo funciona un patrón de conducta o comportamiento dentro del sistema financiero, ese mismo dato se lo podemos poner a la inteligencia artificial para que me diga cuántos tipos de conductas similares se han desencadenado, por ejemplo, en una semana, en 2 semanas o en un mes, y cuántos comportamientos que podrían ser similares a este patrón han sido discordantes con el patrón. Entonces, bueno, básicamente es como nosotros hemos estado utilizando la inteligencia artificial. Es muy importante, y aquí hay un punto que yo quisiera resaltar, que es algo que hemos tratado de resaltar en todas nuestras comisiones, es que, en todos nuestros supervisores, es que la inteligencia artificial definitivamente ayuda, pero nunca va a reemplazar el juicio técnico de los supervisores, porque la expertise del ojo humano siempre es necesaria para poder determinar si algo es un comportamiento inusual dentro del sistema financiero para nosotros o no. La inteligencia artificial nos puede ayudar, sí, ella es la que nos puede dar el monto o las conductas o las cuentas o los clientes que puedan ser discordantes con un cierto patrón. Sin embargo, la decisión final siempre queda en el ojo humano y en el expertise del supervisor. Entonces, para nosotros se ha vuelto, no sé por qué salió así otra vez la diapositiva, pero bueno. Para nosotros se ha vuelto sumamente importante el entender que la inteligencia artificial no reemplaza el juicio humano, que por otro lado es sumamente importante que cuando estamos hablando de datos confidenciales y personales de clientes o usuarios del sistema financiero es algo que debemos resguardar con independencia de cualquier situación con la inteligencia artificial. Para eso una gobernanza de datos es sumamente importante, pero por otro lado también el entender que la calidad de los datos es la que nos va a poder dar los resultados óptimos, porque si no, entonces sería tanto como estar perdiendo el tiempo, por mucho que la inteligencia artificial pueda ser una herramienta valiosa. Si no le metemos los datos de una forma adecuada y que se pueda procesar, entonces no serviría de nada. Muchas gracias.
Flor de Lustre, in English. No, first of all, no, thank you very much for this very super well structured presentation. For me, what I found very, very interesting, the way you put like this transition, you know, and then a very well structured process, and when you show the whole cycle, where you highlight a lot the quality of data, capacity building, and then you go into the process of what are the key uses, etc. No? So going back to our angle as no, the development bank, and trying to have more countries with such a structured approach that you have. No? What do you think are the key elements that we should prioritize if we wanted to replicate your experience in other countries?
First of all, commitment, because these transitions need persons that be compromised with the process, with the quality of the process and the understanding of the process. Then you need to have really super clear what you are waiting for this process, because sometimes it's enhance some process, or maybe you need to be aware of some emergent risk, or maybe you are trying just to be super effective in the outputs, right? So you need to be very clear what you are expecting for the process. And lastly, this multidisciplinary team is very important, because it gives you the point of view that every point of view is important, but when you see it like in an holistical way, it could be very useful. And that's it. I think that are the 3 key elements that I want to highlight in this part.
No, thank you very much, and I agree on all those points very, very clearly. No? And I think this would be applicable to different uses in supervision, no? Not only on the AML and CFD, the multidisciplinary approach. No, thank you very much. Let's pass to the experience of Colombia. Billy, please. The floor is yours.
¿Listo? Buenas tardes. Bueno, en primer lugar, muchas gracias al banco por habernos invitado. De pronto el tema mío, bueno, el perfil mío y el tema es bien distinto a lo que se viene hablando, pero yo me defino como el superusuario de un proceso que ha sido un éxito y vengo a contar la experiencia ya en la aplicación de la inteligencia artificial en los procesos de la superintendencia. Entonces debo decirles primero qué hago yo. Yo soy el superintendente de sociedades de mi país, o sea, soy más o menos, en un lenguaje sencillo, la persona que supervisa todas las empresas de mi país, salvo algunas empresas que por excepción no supervisamos, como por ejemplo las del sector financiero, que tienen un régimen específico que es la superintendencia financiera, o las del sector salud, que tienen otro régimen específico que está relacionado con la salud. Pero la generalidad de las empresas de nuestro país pues están bajo nuestra vigilancia y algunas en especial por su monto, por el monto de los recursos, digamos que por su capacidad económica, pues tienen una vigilancia especial de parte nuestra. Para que se lleven una idea, este estudio que tiene que ver con la aplicación de esta herramienta, estamos hablando aquí aproximadamente de 65.000 empresas en nuestro país y esa información que recauda pues equivale a 6 terabytes más o menos del producto del análisis. Ahora bien, ¿qué hemos hecho nosotros en la superintendencia? Nosotros definimos la superintendencia como una institución, digamos que le cambiamos la concepción de ser una institución que vigila, de ser una institución que sanciona y de ser una institución que juzga, a ser una institución que salva empresas. Pero ¿cómo cambia uno esa mentalidad, ¿no? De dejar de ser una institución que es un policía o dejar de ser una institución que es un juez a convertirse en una institución muy técnica, muy concentrada en las cifras, muy concentrada en la realidad de las empresas, muy concentrada en la prevención, muy concentrada en la capacitación de las empresas y, por supuesto, en la recopilación de una información que le permita establecer una analítica para esa prevención y para esa aproximación a la realidad de las empresas. Porque nosotros entendemos que las empresas no se salvan con la ley. Las empresas se salvan con un componente adicional, que es el acompañamiento técnico y, por supuesto, acompañamiento económico, sobre todo en la realidad de nuestro país o de nuestros países en América Latina. Eso se vio de mejor manera o más ampliamente o más fríamente con la pandemia. Con la pandemia, muchas empresas entraron en situación de dificultad y como país tuvimos que establecer estrategias de choque que permitieran que nosotros pudiésemos reaccionar. Yo he dicho que la pandemia nos sirvió de mucho porque nos cambió la mentalidad y nos invitó a hacer un proceso de transformación que permitiera que las empresas salieran adelante. Y de hecho Colombia, cuando uno mira los indicadores de reacción por la pandemia, Colombia fue uno de los países en el mundo que más rápido reaccionó post pandemia. Y parte de eso desde el punto de vista empresarial está relacionado con esas estrategias que nosotros implementamos, porque el fenómeno de la pandemia no fue solamente el tiempo que estuvimos en pandemia, el fenómeno de la pandemia es la pospandemia y desde el punto de vista empresarial, y ahí es donde nosotros tuvimos que empezar a desarrollar una estrategia de innovación. Bueno, ahí empezamos. ¿Y con qué empezamos? Nosotros empezamos con el expediente, con la construcción de expedientes y audiencias digitales. Entonces empezamos a hacer todo un proceso de innovación que significó que pudiésemos hacer las audiencias de los procesos de salvamento de las empresas, todo sistematizado. Fuimos pioneros en Colombia, somos los pioneros en la sistematización del sistema judicial. Y para que ustedes se lleven una idea, comúnmente un proceso de insolvencia se denomina, o de salvamento empresarial, le llamo yo, un proceso comúnmente demoraba entre 3 y 6 años, más o menos. Hoy en día en Colombia estamos hablando de procesos de 6 meses a lo sumo. O sea que aprendimos la lección con el uso de herramientas tecnológicas que nos permitió acelerar los procesos y volver un proceso absolutamente sistematizado. Por supuesto, eso tiene que ver como una reacción al crecimiento de los procesos pospandemia, más otros conflictos sociales que en nuestro país se dieron, que no es del caso comentarlos aquí. Y eso implicó entonces que establecíamos un sistema de supervisión basado en el uso de herramientas tecnológicas. Ese sistema de supervisión basado en el uso de herramientas tecnológicas, pues se basa en la recopilación de información a través de un lago de datos, que les acabo de hablar, de 6 terabytes, de 65,000 empresas, y estamos hablando de 7,9 billones de dólares, que digamos que ese es el cúmulo de recursos que están en juego gracias al accionar nuestro. Entonces, fíjense ustedes que eso tiene que ver con un número significativo de recursos para nuestro país, para nuestra nación, y eso sin contar el efecto que tiene sobre el empleo, que es el gran motor del empleo. Y por otro lado, también de tener en cuenta que la gran mayoría de las empresas implicadas en los procesos que tienen que ver con la superintendencia de sociedades son micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas. Son aproximadamente el 80% de las empresas del país. Toda esta construcción del sistema de información también nos sirvió para consolidar una estrategia, digamos, yo le llamo también social, en el entendido de hacerle ver al país que las grandes empresas del país son las que nosotros comúnmente llamamos las pequeñas empresas. Nosotros hemos dicho que las grandes empresas del país son la sumatoria de las micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas, que entre otras cosas representan el 80% del empleo del país. Eso hace entonces que nosotros empezáramos a apostarle al margen de recopilar esa información, a establecer una analítica que nos permitiera tomar decisiones, establecer políticas de Estado y también estrategias para el salvamento de las empresas de nuestro país. Construimos entonces un sistema de información societaria, le denominamos el SIS, que es toda la información financiera de las empresas, y ahí nosotros establecemos, ya empezamos a hacer a través del análisis, con el uso de herramientas tecnológicas, podemos identificar previamente la salud de las empresas. Antes de que el empresario llegue a la superintendencia de sociedades, como un hecho sin precedente, ya nosotros a través de la analítica y el uso de la herramienta tecnológica, le decimos al empresario, ojo, que usted ya está en una situación de dificultad. Usted es un potencial candidato a que entre en un default. Usted es un potencial candidato a que su empresa entre en reorganización y la tengamos que intervenir. Y es un potencial candidato que si no ajusta sus procedimientos, si no consigue fuentes de financiación, si no se reorganiza, la palabra técnica de nosotros es, cuando uno entra en proceso de insolvencia, es la reorganización, que es el primer paso, que yo le llamo entrar al médico, o la liquidación, que ya ahí sí es entrar, desafortunadamente, a una funeraria. La apuesta de nosotros como gobierno es ser una clínica, y esa clínica, como sucede con los sistemas de salud, se basa en la prevención. Y esa prevención nos contribuye la herramienta a establecer e identificar, y la herramienta tecnológica nos identifica aquellas empresas que están en dificultad y nosotros debemos intervenir. Y por supuesto, pues eso nos ha dado unos resultados que están a la vista, porque entre otras cosas, en el país también se decía, hoy en día más o menos las empresas que están en proceso de insolvencia, estamos hablando de 5.000 empresas, con lo cual el indicador no es tan alto como otros presagiaban, y nosotros consideramos que gran parte de esa reacción positiva ha sido el uso de esta analítica y las herramientas tecnológicas que nos han permitido establecer un diálogo que es el diálogo de la prevención y la construcción de esa estrategia. Por otro lado, está el módulo de insolvencia que, como lo comenté hace un momento, es un módulo que permite que, en primer lugar, desaparecieron las audiencias presenciales y permite que cuando una empresa entra en dificultad, la empresa desde la casa monta los documentos y la herramienta hace un análisis de la viabilidad o no de recibir o no recibir esa empresa en un proceso de reorganización o de insolvencia, en la denominación genérica. Y la herramienta, por supuesto, tiene un motor que nos ha permitido acelerar ese proceso de admisión y que entre válidamente con la protección de la ley a establecer un diálogo entre acreedores que permita que la empresa no entre en situación de liquidación. Todo eso se hace a través de ese módulo de insolvencia. Y ese módulo es una herramienta y es un motor que implica que todo se haga a través de la nube, que todo se haga virtualmente y que las audiencias también sean virtuales. Entonces, toda la recopilación de la información que debe presentar el empresario, entre otras cosas, estamos hablando de información financiera, de sus estados financieros, de su contabilidad, de su condición legal, está todo parametrizado de tal manera que se hace un análisis y el proceso sigue su curso hasta llegar a las audiencias y la posterior decisión del juez que permite que dentro del proceso de insolvencia se solucione la situación de la empresa. Y el otro módulo importante, digamos, la otra herramienta importante es el tesauro digital. El tesauro digital básicamente recoge toda la doctrina y pensamiento de las decisiones o el precedente judicial de lo que ha sucedido en Colombia. Nosotros somos la máxima autoridad en doctrina del país y esta herramienta digital nos permite aproximarnos al análisis de casos, a la solución de casos, a establecer precedentes, con lo cual, por ejemplo, en los procesos de insolvencia y en particular en la solución de los conflictos societarios, porque nosotros adicionalmente resolvemos conflictos entre socios y dueños. Esa herramienta nos permite establecer cuál ha sido el precedente para las decisiones sobre conflictos similares a la manera de lo que sucede en el common law, por ejemplo, aquí en los Estados Unidos. Y toda esa doctrina la tiene ese tesauro digital y él hace los cruces que le permite al juez tomar decisiones más ágilmente para solucionar los conflictos en materia societaria. Entonces, digamos que esos son los tres componentes de mostrar de parte nuestra como Superintendencia de Sociedades con el uso de herramientas tecnológicas a través de esa información que nosotros le suministramos. Ahí están las cifras entonces de los procesos que nosotros hemos tramitado, los tiempos, la reducción de tiempos de 6 meses antes a 45 días hoy, el gran volumen de empresas que nosotros analizamos y utilizamos técnicas de procesamiento de lenguaje natural y visión artificial, lo que nos ha permitido ser pioneros en materia judicial en nuestro país y por supuesto un referente para otras naciones. Adicionalmente nosotros con ese sistema de información digamos que hemos agilizado la producción de documentos, agilizado la producción de la emisión de informes. Por ejemplo, tenemos los informes de las 1000 empresas más grandes del país, las 10.000 empresas más grandes del país, empresas por sectores, por ejemplo, el informe de las pequeñas y medianas empresas del país y la identificación del valor que tiene desde el punto de vista del Producto Interno Bruto y su aporte, o desde el punto de vista del empleo, y también identificar sectores específicos, como por ejemplo el mundo del deporte y el mundo del fútbol. Ahí también nosotros generamos informes que no tenían precedente y de manera ágil nos ha permitido identificar la salud de ese mundo, que ese mundo también es un mundo empresarial. Lo coloco como ejemplo, pero por supuesto también está todo el tema del sector de la industria en sus diferentes modalidades. Digamos que básicamente entonces es esa nuestra apuesta como superintendencia, y repito, hemos desarrollado una labor dentro de todo el territorio nacional que le ha permitido a toda la ciudadanía, a los empresarios en particular, acceder a los servicios de una superintendencia que hoy en tiene esa visión de prevención, de acompañamiento y de elaboración de diagnósticos para el sector empresarial del país. Muchísimas gracias.
Billy, gracias a ti, ¿no? Yo creo que las tres presentaciones, ¿no? Tienen ahí a dimensiones muy distintas, pero muy complementares, ¿no? Pero una pregunta que tengo es que una parte central de tu presentación fue esta transición, ¿no? Un enfoque, ¿no? de prevención, lo que dijiste en la primera película, ¿no? Y toda una estrategia rica en datos de desarrollo de los sistemas y con resultados impresionantes, ¿no? Entonces, como lecciones que podríamos llevar a otros, ¿no? que quieren implementar y hacer este camino, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son los grandes retos y qué tienen ahí de recomendaciones?
Bueno, la mira, y ojo, no lo está diciendo un ingeniero. La primera es que es muy común en algunas instituciones que se piense que la innovación tecnológica es hacer una gran inversión, porque entre otras cosas, en las empresas en las que yo he participado y he sido miembro de juntas directivas, pues para nadie es un secreto que la gran inversión está en lo tecnológico, y es bastante. Pero yo pienso que más importante que la gran inversión es el cambio cultural. O sea, de nada sirve que nosotros emprendamos cualquier proceso, cualquier inversión, si no se cambia la cultura de la organización. Entonces nosotros lo primero que hicimos fue un cambio cultural muy fuerte. De hecho, les cuento una infidencia. Yo contraté en la superintendencia, mi mano derecha es un psicólogo. Y cuando llegué, me dijeron, y este señor, ¿por qué trajo un psicólogo? Yo vengo del mundo universitario. Y dije, sí, es que yo creo que aquí lo que hay que cambiar es la mentalidad. Y ese psicólogo es experto en neuropsicología. Y ese psicólogo es experto en educación virtual. Viene del mundo, yo también vengo del mundo de la educación virtual. De hecho, la institución más fuerte en Colombia en educación virtual, nosotros nos metimos en ese cuento de llevar educación a todas las regiones del país, a las más apartadas, porque Colombia es un país que tiene muchas dificultades geográficas que hacen que no pueda llegar la educación. Bueno, nosotros salvamos eso. Y con esa mentalidad llegamos a la superintendencia, porque con las empresas pasa lo mismo. Ese derecho que hay en las grandes capitales, que tiene grandes cámaras de comercio, que tienen, eso no pasa en la mayoría de regiones del país. Y el país no tenía esa visión. El país, por eso recientemente incluso publiqué un artículo en los periódicos más importantes del país, en donde yo hablo de las pequeñas grandes empresas. Y esas pequeñas empresas realmente son las grandes empresas del país, porque el país está muy centralizado. Y es voltear la mirada y ver que ahí está el 80% del Producto Interno Bruto, perdón, el 50% del Producto Interno Bruto y el 80% del empleo. Entonces era cambiar. ¿Y cómo llegamos allá? Pues con la innovación, hay que cambiarle la mentalidad a la gente, con la capacitación, y lo otro, la estrategia de la prevención con el uso de las herramientas tecnológicas y la analítica, porque lo otro es, allá teníamos un mundo de información, pero esa información ¿para qué? Y ese para qué es utilizar esa gran información que nosotros tenemos, utilizar las herramientas tecnológicas que nos ayuden a pensar y, por supuesto, Está lo que la herramienta dice y está lo que el juez piensa, como bien dices tú. No es que nos estén desplazando a nosotros la forma de pensar, porque la sensibilidad sí es nuestra. La herramienta nos ayuda a darle un sentido social a esa sensibilidad y poderla aplicar.
Muchas gracias, Viri. Yo creo que aquí el multidisciplinary approach viene de nuevo un ejemplo, ¿no? Claro que dijiste, ¿no? Creo que hay muchos puntos comunes que levantamos acá y el de capacitación es uno que creo que todos hablaron muy claramente, ¿no? Sobre esto, ¿no? Vamos a abrir para las preguntas y yo tengo algunas más, pero no quiero.
Bueno, gracias a los tres por las presentaciones, muy buenas. La pregunta es para Simoni, y sobre qué opinas de trasladar el esquema de Subtech, que hoy es mayoritariamente en el sector financiero, los sectores de utilities, infraestructura, energía eléctrica, en donde tal vez la gobernanza es muy similar, los incentivos, los desafíos de reducir las simetrías de información, y que hoy no se ve en general, ¿no? Gracias.
If I understand correctly, what is portable from Subtech to other verticals? Yes.
Oh,
How some of the lessons from Subtech can be
yeah,
ported?
it's how you see the implementation of Subtech mechanisms in infrastructure sectors, energy, water, telecommunications, because this is a tool that is mainly used, and in some cases in central banks, stock exchange commissions, but no more than that. And in those other sectors, when you have an independent regulator, the challenges are the same: how to reduce asymmetries in information, improve consumer welfare, and so on.
So thank you so much. I think I've been very lucky to spend 20 years in financial sector development working with central banks for two reasons. First, because usually innovation comes first in the financial sector and a few others, but it's one of the sectors of our economy that always innovates: banks, fintechs, digital assets, we're talking now. And also because central banks are very trusted. They're seen in many countries. I come from Italy, not only as a peer, but also as a peer that is very specialized, very technical, always on point. And so I think there is a lot that we can learn with legitimacy from Subtech and export. And thanks, because you really bring me to what I wanted to say, which is like, yes, we're talking about training, we're talking about culture, we're talking about many things that at the end fall into change management. And so we do so many conferences on different topics. We don't do many on change management, but change management is the key. It's what will stay. We talk about AI and we talk about change management. We talk about quantum, and we're going to talk more about quantum, and we're going to talk about change management. So that's what we need to resolve, also to create resilience for the new waves of innovation that continue to come, because tech continue to come. And if we don't want to have exactly the same conversation in 4 years from now on quantum for better regulation in Latin America, we need to work on that layer. So it's much easier, I think, to export some lessons from there, and not to think about exporting necessarily the use cases of the technologies that will come. We can find ways to make code and to make data sets applicable also to other verticals. But if we really refine how we take some of the lessons on the change management layer, I think that's where the acceleration happens. And also possibly there is a partner in the ecosystem that really works on sovereign debt and in green bonds, sovereign debt management. And they came to say, we need to do in sovereign debt exactly what you have been doing for 8 years on Subtech. That's exactly the same journey, but they are there and they're like, what do we do with tech? What do we do with AI? And so also these type of opportunities where we bring experiences from SupTech into GovTech to inspire other agencies to make sure that everybody understands that this is possible. I think that's the first step. But then again, like taking methodologies and taking frameworks. And honestly, with GovSpace, that's what we want to do. We built and tested with 2,000 users a diagnostic tool that not an agency can do a self-diagnostics without needing any consultant, nor me, no McKinsey, no others. They just do it, and then they come to us with their own understanding, collaboratively, to analyze. And that's the way Peru, superintendents, and others have been doing. Like, what do you think about the results of our diagnostics? That tool can be quickly tweaked to all type of government agencies to do an AI readiness diagnostic. It will take very little to use the tool in health, in tech, in agri, because so many layers, again, are around the change management. And then so you just review the use cases, the taxonomy as the bottom, and you're ready to go and to scale into verticals in a quite economic way. Thank you for the great question. Sorry for the long answer, but it's very juicy.
Muchas gracias. Tal vez para la Comisión Nacional Bancaria, primero que todo, pues el caso es sumamente interesante dentro de la investigación que hemos venido realizando. El caso de la Comisión nos ha ayudado mucho a entender el tema SupTech. Tal vez mi pregunta es, frente a ese tiempo, usted comentaba 6 meses para un entrenamiento, para, digamos, para poder tal vez hacer un fine tuning y que estos sistemas empiecen a funcionar. ¿Todavía sienten que ese tiempo sea necesario? Digamos, sienten que este tipo digamos, de tiempo para lograr ese calibre, digamos, y que el sistema funcione, va a ser un requisito y, digamos, ven que eso vaya a ser en otros casos. Y unido a eso, tal vez la otra pregunta es, ¿cómo poder, y tal vez esto es para todos, cómo poder llevar el tema de SupTech fuera del sector financiero y a otras autoridades que también creo que tienen mucho interés, pero por ahora lo vemos muy concentrado en este sector? Entonces, esos 2 puntos. Muchas gracias.
No, yo creo que 6 meses, digamos, es como un aproximado considerando la etapa inicial. Sin embargo, como bien dices, una vez que ya vaya avanzando también el refinamiento, el entendimiento por un lado, también el machine learning vaya haciendo su trabajo, entonces es muy probable que este tiempo se vaya acortando. Lo cierto es que estos tipos de análisis son bastante especializados. Es probable que por eso el SupTech se haya desarrollado mucho en el sector financiero, porque son análisis ya muy focalizados y altamente, digamos, especializados. Sin embargo, creo que exportar el SupTech a otros sectores, y digo mi antecedente inmediato es, también tengo experiencia en el sector regulatorio. Entonces creo que no es nada difícil poderlo llevar siempre y cuando se tenga en cuenta algo, ¿no? Nuevamente, ¿para qué? ¿Qué tipo de supervisión vas a hacer? Si es una supervisión que requiere datos, por supuesto que va a ser muy útil. Si es una supervisión que requiere un tema de temas regulatorios, es decir, que cumples con ciertas cosas, entonces sí va a ser muy útil. Porque no todas las supervisiones se basan necesariamente en eso, pero hay otras que sí. Entonces, digamos, mientras exista esa asimetría, puede ser. Y por otro lado, mientras justamente las bases de recolección de datos, el refinamiento y la forma en cómo se analizan sean similares para poder dar los resultados similares, entonces sí que podría realizarse. Me parece que esas serían las premisas, pero sí puede ser. ¿Y por qué esas se quedan en el sector financiero? Me parece que es eso, porque aquí es donde fuertemente trae un área de especialización. Pero eso no quiere decir que debiera ser exclusivo del sector financiero. I don't know if someone else want to provide an answer.
A practical example, what I mentioned, the project with the 26 agencies in the Philippines. What they started from was from the chatbot that we developed in 2017 and a case management system with the Central Bank of the Philippines. So they saw that example, they saw that Bob was deployed formally, and successfully, and they mandated, okay, we want the same across all the governments. Now we had already an advantage point in working on the project because we had already some specs, we had already some, even some wireframes that we could have taken and reused. So there is a reusability of some of these tools and also some of the assets and some of the data products that we can have. Just that came to my mind as a concrete example of exactly. It started with SupTech, all the government now is the same level.
No, para complementar sobre la pregunta, Armando. En este momento estamos trabajando nosotros con 7 superintendencias de Chile, inspirados por el trabajo que hizo la superintendencia bancaria o la superintendencia financiera de Chile en los datos, en curar datos, en depurar datos, en tener las bases listas para utilizar como una segunda etapa herramientas de inteligencia artificial en la supervisión. Entonces, retomando lo que estaba diciendo Simone, creo que hay un camino que abrió el sector financiero, en donde hay una legitimidad ganada, en donde hay unas metodologías ganadas y en donde hay otras superintendencias que están queriendo seguir el camino. Y creo que el caso particular de Chile va a ser muy interesante de ver cómo va a avanzar en los sectores que cubre, dado que todas las otras superintendencias están en este momento en ese proceso de mejorar la calidad de datos para poder llegar a un tema más de inteligencia artificial.
Perdón, yo le agrego, a propósito de lo que tú dices, pues es precisamente lo que comentamos acá, ¿no? De construir un sistema de información sólido. Llegó a ser tan sólido que dijimos, bueno, ¿qué vamos a hacer con eso? Y la idea es dar el paso siguiente a través de ese machine learning que nos permita sacar diagnósticos y tomar decisiones, como de hecho es lo que venimos haciendo. Ahora, ahí vimos 3 escenarios. El paso que sigue es poder articular esos 3 escenarios, de la información de la prevención, de la información de la doctrina, sumar esos 3 escenarios para que exista una herramienta que lo sepa leer y nos ayude a seguir mejorando.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Tenemos. Yo tengo. ¿Hay online? No. No, sí, por favor. El problema de ser la última sesión del día, ¿no? Un día muy lleno. Pero hay una pregunta online. Las otras preguntas pregunto después. Sí.
So this one is for Simone. To complement the discussion on AI readiness, since governance, data, systems, and teams ultimately depend on people readiness, especially among public servants and citizens who are not AI experts, have you considered incorporating a structured and easily absorbable approach to reduce public and institutional aversion as a core component of AI readiness frameworks, particularly to bridge this gap in LAC, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and potentially in other regions as well?
So yes, we for example, we have broken and we continue to break our offering in terms of training into different models. So there are deeper trainings that are like 6 weeks, 8 to 9 hours a week. But then we have the AI boot camps that I think we had a conversation also about possibly doing it in this conference, and hopefully we can do it. And it's like 2 days. And in 2 days, we can bring people to touch tech. We did it 10 years ago for the Bank for International Settlements before they created the Innovation Hub. We brought that some fintech applications. We're like, what do you think is like the tech behind it? Like, okay, is that and that. like how is the technology working? And now you start understanding the risks. Like we don't all need to be data scientists, but if we have enough of that knowledge to have a conversation with the data scientists, and also we train data scientists to speak the language of supervisors, because the more they start to understand in the use cases, we need to bring these words together. It's not a case that we're calling it GovTech. It's because there are two words that really come together, like in SupTech. It's like a supervisory use case and a technology that needs to serve it. And it's always a use case that needs to lead. And then also, like, as I say, like how create value more around training and around capacity building. I think there are so many ways to continue an ongoing training, and that's part of what we're building into GovSpace, so that people are not just taking a training, but they continue to learn from each other over time. One last second, another idea about scalability, for example, is to build an API builder. Like make an API builder available to government agencies in Latin America that can be already an asset that it's relatively cheap to develop, and I think will be very, very welcome and accelerate. So we can identify tools that accelerate and scale, because acceleration and scalability is what we're talking about.
Excellent, Simone. Thank you very much. I want to thank the panelists for being here. We're actually finishing 5 minutes before the time. I'm sure that everybody appreciates that. So we'll have a cocktail very, very soon. No? So with that, thank you very much to all.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our speakers, moderators, and participants for joining us today, virtually and including traveling from all over the world, in some cases arriving straight to the conference, and also for sharing all of your insights and experiences. The discussions we've had highlighted the transformative potential of AI in creating smarter, more effective, and more inclusive regulatory systems across Latin America and the Caribbean. We encourage you to continue the conversations, exchange ideas, and explore collaborations beyond this room. Friendly reminder that tomorrow we will have a full day of sessions. You can go on the IDV website, find the event, and download the agenda there. And also, we encourage you to take advantage of our coffee breaks tomorrow, where we will have not only our participants, but also we're having the participation of 4 companies from Chile, Colombia, and Brazil, who are providing red tech solutions to governments. So we encourage you to just use the time to get to know each other and network. And now we actually invite you to join us. Please stay for a cocktail just right behind us at the plaza, where we can continue to reflect on today's discussions and connect with all participants. Thank you, everyone.